Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. Back in 1972, Mark and I drove up to this old family cabin near Waterford, Vermont. We'd never been there before, and honestly, I only knew it from a few faded photos my grandmother had shown me when I was younger. It sat near a thick patch of woods and not too far from a slow, cold river. It felt remote, like we were stepping into some strange corner of the world that time forgot. We were there to sort through old belongings and clean it up a bit, maybe prepare it for summer visits or even consider selling it. We had no idea what we'd walked into. As soon as we got inside, I could tell something wasn't right. The cabin had always been simple, a one-story wood structure with a low roof. But now there were odd holes in the ceiling, small ones that didn't look like normal wear and tear. Instead of dust and old boxes, we found sharp tools and kitchen knives left in weird spots, like stuck into the wooden table or laid out on the floor in a way that seemed too deliberate. Mark joked at first, asking if someone had tried to pull a prank or if maybe animals had dragged things around. But it didn't feel like a joke to me. It felt like we'd interrupted something. Outside, it was quiet in a way that puts you on edge. I could hear the river in the distance, but no birds, no rustling in the underbrush. It was all too still. The sky was getting darker, and the cabin's tiny windows didn't let in much light anyway. We had a few lanterns and flashlights, and we moved from room to room trying to understand what happened. Everything was scattered, some utensils were missing from the drawers, and there were marks on the wood floors, long, narrow scratches like something heavy had been dragged. The place smelled off too, musty, but with something else I couldn't name. Every time I moved, I felt like someone was watching me. By the time the sun had set, we tried to settle in. We had no TV, just a radio that crackled too much to be useful. I remember Mark pacing around, trying to convince himself it was just raccoons or maybe a bear that somehow got in. It didn't make sense, but we both needed a logical explanation. We decided to stay, as crazy as that sounds now. Neither of us wanted to drive back so late, and we thought we'd figure it out in the morning. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound above us. It was a thump, then another, and then something heavy moving back and forth. It was as if there were a bunch of large animals running around on the roof. Mark and I looked at each other, wide-eyed. We got up, and he grabbed the broom, thinking he might scare off whatever was up there. He hit the ceiling a few times. The second he did, there was a scream, not human, not any animal I'd ever heard. It was shrill, and it made my ears ring. I felt disoriented, dizzy. Mark stumbled back, and for a moment we just stood there in silence, both of us trying to process what we'd just heard. I went over to the window, carefully lifting a corner of the dusty curtain, and I swear I saw them. Tall, bulky figures standing near the edge of the woods, covered in dark hair, almost like huge men, but not quite right. Their proportions were off, their arms too long, their posture strange. I saw at least 2 or 3 of them, but maybe there were more hidden in the shadows. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could barely breathe. Mark came to my side and looked too. He grabbed my arm, not saying a word, but I knew he saw them. They moved so quietly despite their size. We'd hear a branch snap or a low grunt, but mostly it was just the feeling of them being there, surrounding the cabin. At one point, one of them got close to the front door. I could hear the doorknob rattling. It was so deliberate, like it understood what a door was and how to get inside. Mark tried to barricade it with the old sofa while I held the flashlight and tried not to cry. I felt completely helpless. With no cell phones back then, we had to rely on the old landline phone that was still connected for some reason. Mark called the local operator, babbling something about intruders. We weren't even sure how to describe them. He said something like, "There are these huge people outside, covered in fur," which sounded insane. We were told someone would come out to help. Until then, we were alone. I remember pressing my face near the window again, trying to see if they were still out there, and one of them stepped right up to the glass. It was massive, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall. Its face was partially obscured by hair, but I could see large, broad teeth and eyes that reflected the moonlight. It pressed its body against the glass, almost like it was mocking me. I screamed, dropping the flashlight. I felt like I was going to pass out. The thing made a kind of chattering sound, and I could see fog from its breath on the glass. Then it walked away casually, as if it knew it had scared the hell out of me. We tried shining lights at the roof through a small attic hatch, hoping to scare off whatever was up there. Nothing worked. There were footsteps overhead, scratching, and that horrible scream that I can still remember, as if it happened yesterday. It sounded like a human in pain and an animal combined, something completely unnatural. We heard more shuffling by the windows, and every time the door rattled, my heart jumped into my throat. I remember clinging to Mark's arm, feeling his sweat on my hand, both of us just shaking. Eventually, after what felt like hours, we saw headlights through the trees. A police car was coming down the dirt road. The noises on the roof stopped immediately. The figures by the window slipped away into the darkness of the forest. By the time the officers reached our door and shone their flashlights around, everything seemed normal, at least on the outside. They looked around, went behind the cabin with their guns drawn, but found nothing. We tried telling them what we saw, but they just asked if we'd been drinking or if there might have been a bear. They weren't rude, but they seemed off, like they knew something but wouldn't say it. They mentioned that sometimes large animals get curious, but they never confirmed anything beyond that. After they left, Mark and I sat on the old sofa, stunned. We didn't sleep. By morning, we walked around outside and saw enormous footprints in the mud near the trees. They were human-like, but too large, with toes spread wide. Some branches were snapped high up, well above my reach. The more we looked, the more terrified we felt. Something had been there, something too smart and too strong to be a bear or a prankster in a costume. We gathered our things and left that same day, not even finishing the job we came to do. To this day, I have no logical explanation. We told friends and family, and they looked at us like we were crazy. The police never followed up. We never saw anything like that again. Sometimes I think I see shapes in the woods when I'm out hiking, but it's just my mind playing tricks. Still, I know what I saw that night. I know what we both went through. I don't care if anyone believes me. I remember the fear, the sounds, the way those creatures moved and how they seemed to enjoy tormenting us. It all started and ended in that single horrible night, and it's something I'll never be able to shake. Story 2. I still remember that day in the summer of 1999 like it just happened. My wife and I had planned a 7-day hike through the Marble Mountains, starting at this place called Lovers Camp, near a small rural community by Happy Camp, California. It was supposed to be a simple, quiet trip, just hiking, fishing, and enjoying the lakes and valleys. We had done similar trips before, though never in that exact area, so we were excited. The atmosphere felt different from our previous outings, and I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, it was just so still. No wind rustling through leaves, no bird calls, nothing. It seemed like the forest had gone silent just for us. At the time, I figured it was just a calm day. Maybe the wildlife stayed deeper in the woods. On that particular afternoon, we reached Spirit Lake, and it was as quiet and peaceful looking as a postcard. My wife decided to stay close to our campsite to swim a bit near the shore. I told her I'd circle around, try to fish off some rocky areas, and maybe find a better spot for us to rest. Every so often, we'd catch each other's eye across the water, just to make sure all was fine. I had a small rod, a simple lure, and I was just pacing around the edge of the lake, trying different spots. But something was off. I kept feeling like someone was behind me, but whenever I turned, I saw nothing. No people, no large animals, just dense pine trees and thick undergrowth. I remember the smell of the forest being a bit different too, earthy, damp, but somehow heavy, if that makes sense. It's hard to put into words. After a while, I went back to the campsite. My wife looked uneasy. She asked if I felt strange, and I admitted I did. We both agreed that something felt wrong. We noticed how unnaturally quiet it was. Not a single bird chirping, not a squirrel darting around. Just us, the water, and that eerie silence. We decided maybe we were just tired and would feel better by morning. We ate a quick snack, set up the tent properly, and got inside before it got too dark. We lay there, not really asleep, just trying to relax. It was probably close to midnight when we heard it. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, outside the tent. They weren't the sound of deer hooves or a bear ambling around. It felt more like something walking on two legs just outside the thin nylon barrier. I couldn't move. I could feel my wife tense up beside me. We barely breathed. The steps were so close. Then we heard this breathing, low, wet-sounding, like someone with a big chest inhaling in short bursts. We didn't dare unzip the tent. We knew it was stupid to provoke a large animal in the middle of nowhere. Then we heard something that made us both stare at each other in disbelief. It sounded like something urinating, loud, forceful, splashing just a few feet away. It went on longer than I expected, as if this thing had no concern that we were inside the tent. I remember holding my wife's hand and feeling her shaking. We just stayed silent, hoping it would leave. Eventually it stopped. The footsteps shifted away, crunching softly into the distance until I couldn't hear them anymore. We stayed awake for a long time after that, just listening, but nothing else happened for a while. I think we both managed to doze off at some point, though my sleep was shallow and full of strange half-dreams. I don't know how much later, but it was still dark, probably the early hours before dawn, when the sounds returned, but this time it was different. We woke up to branches snapping, something big moving quickly through the brush toward us. It sounded more aggressive, like it was charging in our direction. My heart pounded. I could feel my breath catching in my throat. We froze again, absolutely silent, not sure what the hell to do. The thing got so close we could hear its breathing again, louder and heavier, and these weird low grunts or guttural sounds. It circled around our tent, not in a playful way, but in a sort of tense, testing manner. The fabric of the tent fluttered slightly as something large passed very close to it. I thought I might see a shadow, but it was too dark inside, and we didn't have the guts to shine a flashlight out. We never heard a growl or anything that screamed predator, but there was something about its presence that felt way too smart, too aware of us, as if it was checking us out. It didn't feel like a normal animal stumbling into our sight. It felt deliberate, like it knew we were in there and was trying to see what we'd do. After a few long minutes, it retreated again. We heard branches rustling, steps fading, and eventually silence. I have no idea what time it was by then, but neither of us slept after that. We just lay there, shaking, listening. The forest felt oppressive. I kept thinking maybe it would come back, maybe it was waiting for us to come out. I felt like prey, and that's not something I'm used to. At the first hint of dawn, we got out of the tent. We moved fast, and I remember that my body felt stiff from the tension. The place smelled horrible. There was this lingering odor around our campsite, almost like a wet dog smell, but heavier and more pungent. Our clothes that we had hung up to dry outside were knocked down and carried a strange stench. We found footprints too, though they weren't clear enough to say, "This is a foot." It was more like large depressions in the soft ground, bigger than a human footprint, but not shaped like a bear's paw either, just big and kind of oval, with some sort of pattern in the dirt, maybe toes. I'm not entirely sure. We looked at each other, both pale, both just wanting to get the hell out of there. We skipped breakfast. Neither of us could stomach the thought of hanging around. We packed up and started hiking back along the route we'd come in, not waiting another second. We spent the entire hike out listening for sounds behind us, but we heard nothing. The forest seemed to relax a bit as we moved further away from that lake. We were too shaken to talk much until we got back to civilization. When we finally did speak about it, we still didn't know what to say. We never got a glimpse of this thing, only the noises, the smell, the strange behavior. Over time, we heard vague stories of people disappearing in that region and others who claimed odd sightings. I don't know what we encountered. Maybe it was just some weird animal I can't identify, or maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever it was, the feeling of being watched and tested like that still makes my skin crawl. I've gone camping since then, but I never returned to that area. I still think about it sometimes, especially late at night. I remember how quiet the woods were and that weird sense of being sized up. I remember the heavy footsteps right outside our thin shelter, the unsettling sound of something marking its territory, and the strange grunts in the darkness. Even now, I don't have a neat explanation. We never saw it, so I can't say for sure what it was. But I know that in the early morning light of that summer day in 1999, I left Spirit Lake feeling like I'd encountered something out there that wasn't supposed to exist, or at least not in any form I'd ever imagined. I still get chills thinking about it. Story 3. I still remember that summer day in 1987 like it just happened yesterday. It was warm, but not too hot, with one of those gentle breezes you sometimes get up near the Smokies. I lived in a small town close to Gatlinburg back then, and I'd decided to take my daughter, she was about 7 at the time, up the skylift. You know, one of those attractions where you sit on a bench suspended by a cable and slowly ride up a hillside to get a panoramic view. It seemed like a perfect father-daughter thing to do, nice and calm, and I expected maybe to see some birds, maybe a bear if we were lucky, but nothing out of the ordinary. I remember sitting there with her on my lap, so she'd feel safe. The sky was clear, just a few lazy clouds drifting by, and the trees below were dense and green. The lift wasn't crowded that day, surprisingly quiet, in fact, which was unusual, but I didn't think anything of it at the time. It just felt like we had the mountainside more or less to ourselves. My daughter was excited, pointing out things as we rose higher, tiny cabins off in the distance, squirrels scurrying around. Nothing strange. Then, at some point as we were maybe halfway up, she tapped me on the arm and pointed down at the slope below. She didn't say anything at first, just tugged my shirt and pointed. I leaned over the safety bar to get a better look, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it might be a black bear. That wouldn't have been weird, considering where we were. But this thing was upright, like a man, and it was holding something large in its arms. It took me a second to focus. The movement of the skylift didn't help, but I was certain what I saw. A big, dark figure walking on 2 legs, carrying what looked like a deer. I'm not talking about dragging it. I mean, it was holding this animal like you'd carry a sack. My daughter whispered something that sounded like big monkey, and hearing her say that actually made my heart skip. I knew we didn't have anything like monkeys around there, and the shape, the build of this thing, was all wrong for a bear. Bears can stand on 2 legs, sure, but they don't walk that way for long distances, and they sure don't carry deer over their arms like a rolled-up carpet. It's hard to describe the shape exactly, but it was tall, broad in the shoulders, covered in something dark. Fur or hair, I'm not sure. Even from a distance I could tell it had mass, real bulk, and it moved smoothly, not like a stumbling animal. It looked strong, incredibly strong. I think I said something like, "What the hell?" under my breath, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. My daughter was clinging to me, and I could feel her trembling. She knew something was off. Her grip on my arm was too tight. The strangest part was how this thing carried itself. Confident, steady, like it belonged there. It didn't seem panicked or rushed. I expected it to run off as soon as it realized we were above, but instead it glanced around as if it was just another day in the woods. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I swear it turned its head in a way that suggested it was aware of us. That thought made my stomach twist. I looked back over my shoulder to see if anyone else on the skylift had noticed. There were a few other chairs behind us, some with tourists looking out at the view, but no one seemed alarmed or even particularly focused on the spot where I was looking. They were just chatting, looking upward or fiddling with their cameras. It struck me as bizarre. How could they not see it? I wanted to shout, "Do you see that thing down there?" But my throat felt dry and tight. I didn't want to scare my daughter any more than she already was. By the time I turned back, the figure was moving toward a denser patch of trees. It disappeared behind some thick brush for a few seconds. Then I saw a flash of it again further down the slope, stepping easily over a fallen log. The entire time, it cradled that deer like it weighed nothing. Then, just like that, it was gone. It slipped into the vegetation and vanished. I kept scanning the hillside, but there was no sign of it. The forest went back to being just a forest. No strange silhouette, no rustling branches, no broken leaves lying in an obvious trail. It was like a living phantom had just passed through. As the skylift approached the top, my daughter pressed her face into my shoulder. She was breathing in short, quiet gasps, scared and confused. I tried to reassure her, told her maybe it was just a big bear or something else normal, but I couldn't even convince myself. Her calling it a big monkey stuck in my head. It didn't feel like a bear. It didn't feel like any animal I've ever seen. And growing up near these mountains, I've seen my share of wildlife. Nothing matches what I saw that day. Once we hopped off at the top, I looked around for somebody in charge or maybe another visitor who might have seen it. I asked a few people, kind of casually, if they saw anything weird on the way up, an animal or something unusual moving around the hillside. Everyone just gave me blank looks or shrugged. A couple of folks laughed it off like I was making a joke. I know they thought I was messing with them, but I wasn't. My daughter wouldn't even look up from my side. She just wanted to go back down. She was pale, and I remember how quiet she got. She was normally a chatty kid, but after that, she withdrew into herself. That scared me almost as much as the sight of that creature. I decided not to push the subject. After all, what would I even say? I saw a big ape-like thing carrying a deer. Who would believe that? Especially in the late 80s. In that area, nobody was going around talking about Bigfoot or anything like that. I think some locals had their stories, but it wasn't exactly a casual conversation topic. People would think I was nuts, or worse, that I was trying to stir up rumors. So we rode back down. I didn't see anything on the return trip. The woods looked normal again, just trees, rocks, maybe a chipmunk skittering here and there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that didn't belong in a simple, ordinary afternoon. My daughter huddled close the whole ride down. When we reached the bottom and started to head home, she barely said a word. I tried to give her some kind of explanation. "It was probably just a strange-looking bear," I said, but she just shook her head. I think she knew I was lying. Over the years, I only told a few people about it. Most of them just nodded politely or laughed. You can't really expect someone to believe that you saw a creature walking upright with a deer in its arms, looking for all the world like some giant, hairy person. But I know what I saw. I know what my daughter saw. Her reaction was so genuine, so full of terror and confusion that I can't doubt what happened. She never liked talking about it afterward. Even a year or two later, if I brought it up, she'd go quiet and find something else to do. I don't have a neat explanation, and I guess that's what bothers me most. There's no tidy ending to this story. We didn't stick around to investigate. We didn't find tracks or get a photo. I just remember the details. The way its shoulders looked heavy and rounded, the way the fur or hair seemed darker than a bear's and more uniform, the way it moved so smoothly and deliberately. I remember the numb feeling in my legs when I realized what I was seeing wasn't normal, and the pit in my stomach that formed when I looked back and realized nobody else was paying attention. That sense of isolation has stuck with me, even decades later. It's like we had this bizarre, terrifying little secret that no one else wanted to share. I still think about it from time to time. I try to rationalize it, but I always come up empty. Could a bear ever really do that? Could a person dressed in a costume be that tall and strong and handle a deer like that? And what would they be doing out there, away from the main trails, hidden beneath the lift route on a random summer afternoon? None of it adds up, and that's what keeps the memory so sharp. In the end, I'm left with nothing but questions and the unsettling memory of that thing disappearing into the trees. I've stopped trying to get anyone to believe me. I know what we saw. I don't have proof, just the lingering image in my mind. That's how it happened. And after that day, life just went on as normal. The trees didn't give up any secrets. The mountains stayed silent, and whatever that thing was, it never showed itself to me again. I can't explain it, and maybe I never will. All I know is that on that summer afternoon in 1987, high above a quiet hillside near Gatlinburg, I caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist, and yet there it was, real as the wood beneath my feet and the sky overhead. Story 4. I remember that summer of 1978 so clearly, even though I've tried for decades to push it out of my mind. I was young then, probably 19, maybe 20, and I was back home near Grayling, Michigan. I'd grown up in a tiny township just outside the town. It was the kind of place where the forests practically started at your backyard fence and stretched out for miles. As a kid, I'd run around those woods without a second thought, hunting with my dad, camping with friends, fishing in creeks, and just exploring. The trees, the streams, and the thick undergrowth had always felt safe, familiar, like home. By the time I was old enough to hunt on my own, I knew those trails better than most people know their own streets. I'm not bragging, it's just how life was out there. Everyone hunted, everyone fished, and you had this kind of unwritten understanding with the woods. You respected them, and they gave back in their own quiet ways. Deer were common, and if you knew where to look, you'd find small game everywhere. The whole forest was alive, always moving, always chattering with birds and squirrels, the sound of distant branches snapping, leaves rustling in the breeze. It was never silent. At least, it wasn't until that day. I had gone out with a close friend, a guy I'd known since childhood. We'd planned to get some deer that morning. Early summer sun, not too hot, but warm enough that you'd sweat under your jacket if you moved around too much. We left camp just after dawn and started walking through familiar hunting ground, places where I knew animal tracks by heart. But that day, something felt off. I can't explain it exactly. It was just too quiet. Normally, even if you didn't see deer right away, you'd catch sight of birds, chipmunks darting across fallen logs, maybe flush a rabbit or two. But that morning, nothing. No movement, no chirps, no distant flap of wings. It was as if someone had pressed the mute button on the entire forest. We tried to keep a normal pace, tried not to spook ourselves. We just thought, maybe the animals are acting weird today, or maybe a predator is nearby. That would sometimes cause wildlife to go silent. But I had never experienced a silence this complete. We moved deeper in, our rifles at the ready, scanning the area, straining our ears for any sound that would break the tension. After about an hour, without spotting so much as a squirrel, we both started feeling uneasy. I remember giving my friend a look, and he nodded slightly, like he felt it too. We decided to head back to camp. As we turned around, we heard this distant crack, just one branch snapping somewhere behind us. We froze. It was so quiet that even a small twig snapping sounded like a gunshot in that silence. We waited, thinking maybe a deer or a black bear had wandered close. Then we heard more, leaves shifting, a weight pressing on the forest floor. It was big. You can tell the difference between a deer stepping lightly and something heavier. My heart started pounding. We couldn't see anything. The trees were thick, and the light that filtered through was dappled, throwing patterns all around us. We took a few careful steps, trying not to make noise, but the sounds kept following. Each step we took, it took one too, as if it was mirroring us. The panic started building inside me. I wanted to believe it was a bear, but it didn't sound quite right. Bears move with more obvious weight, and they don't usually stalk humans like that. When a bear is curious, you know it. This sounded calculated, like something pacing us. We quickened our steps, not running but hurrying, and that's when it started making more noise, pressing closer. I remember the hairs on my neck standing up as we finally caught a glimpse of it. At first, it looked like something low to the ground, maybe crouching. Its shape was hard to make out. It blended into the dim greens and browns of the forest floor. But it was large, too large for a deer, and it moved in a strange way, not like a four-legged animal, and not exactly like a person either. It was hunched, and its arms, or front limbs, I honestly don't know what to call them, seemed longer than its legs. My friend whispered, "What is that?" under his breath, but I barely heard him. I was too focused on what was in front of us. We took another slow step backward, and that's when it made a sound. I've never heard anything like it before or since. It was a low, guttural noise like a growl, but it had this almost a strange resonance to it. It wasn't just in my ears. I felt it in my chest, like a vibration. It reminded me of a large cat's growl, but deeper and somehow distorted. The sound shot fear straight into my gut. My friend panicked and scrambled up a nearby tree. He was always a good climber, and he made it look effortless, but I could see he was terrified. I was stuck there, my knees locked, staring at this thing. It was still hunched, but then it started to straighten up. When it stood on two legs, it was huge, tall as a really large man, but more muscular, and covered in what looked like dark, matted hair. I couldn't see its face clearly, but the shape of its head and shoulders didn't match any animal I knew. Not a bear, not a moose, certainly not a deer. It took a few steps closer, and I could see its arms hanging long at its sides. They looked too long, almost reaching its knees. My heart was hammering, and I could barely breathe. It sniffed the air a couple of times, and I swear I saw it tilt its head slightly, like it was sizing me up, trying to figure out what I was. Then, as if it just lost interest or got spooked, it moved. Not slowly, not lumbering like you'd expect from something so big. It moved fast. It bolted sideways, weaving between the trees with a speed that left me stunned. In a matter of seconds, it was gone, like it had never been there at all. The silence rushed back in, and all I could hear was my friend's ragged breathing from up in the branches and my own pounding heartbeat. I managed to call out to him, and he climbed down, shaking, his face pale. We didn't know what to say to each other. What do you say after something like that? We grabbed our gear and hurried back to camp, looking over our shoulders every few steps. By the time we got back, we didn't have any explanation for what we'd seen. We sat there in silence for a long time, too afraid to go back out, too ashamed to tell anyone what happened. Who would believe us? I've thought about it so many times since then. We never found footprints or fur, never saw any sign that would help us make sense of it. We just had those memories burned into our minds. For years, I didn't mention it to anyone else, and when I finally did, I got the reaction I expected: skepticism, jokes, disbelief. It's not something you can prove, and I understand why people don't buy it. But I know what I saw. I know the weight of that silence in the forest, the smell of damp earth, the way the pine needles crunched under my boots, and that thing, tall, massive, almost human but not quite, something that didn't fit into any category I knew. Since that day, the woods near Grayling never felt the same to me. I kept hunting for a few more years, but I was never fully at ease. I'd catch myself tensing up at the slightest sound behind me. I never saw it again, but I always felt like something was out there, watching from behind the thick trunks, just out of sight. Maybe we surprised it that morning, or maybe it was curious about us. I don't know. All I know is that it was there, and then it was gone, leaving me with a memory I can't shake. It never made any sense, and I've never found a proper explanation. Nothing else in those woods ever came close to what we encountered that day. Some people say stories like this are just tall tales, but I don't care what they think. I know what happened. I can still feel that fear in my bones, and I'm not sure I'll ever fully understand what we saw that morning in the Michigan woods. It just happened, and then it stopped. No warnings, no follow-up encounters, no neat ending. Just silence, and a memory that still makes the hair on my neck stand up. Story 5. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it happened back in the summer of 2012. I had just moved into this small house outside Cooperstown, New York. It was surrounded by farmland and woods, the kind of place that's supposed to be peaceful. Back then, I truly believed I'd found my quiet corner of the world. I couldn't wait to get away from the noise of the city and settle into a simpler life. But that day, the day I'm about to talk about, changed everything. My sister Susan had come to visit me. She was thinking about building her own place not far from mine, and we'd spent the morning going over some rough plans and walking around the property. We were both excited, or at least trying to be, though I'd already confessed to her that I was feeling uneasy. I didn't tell her that I'd been feeling watched since I moved in. I only mentioned some weird noises at night, kind of brushing it off as wildlife. But I think she could see it in my face. She's my sister after all. It was late afternoon when we decided to check out the area near the small lake behind my place. I'd gone there a few times before. Nothing remarkable, just a quiet spot. But that afternoon, the atmosphere felt off. The air seemed heavier. I remember Susan wrinkling her nose like something smelled bad, but we couldn't pinpoint what it was. The lake's surface looked normal enough, just a dull reflection of the grayish sky. There was a slight breeze rattling the leaves. But then we noticed something strange along the soft soil near the edge of the water. There were these impressions in the mud, way too large to be from a person. It wasn't just the size. Something about the shape was off. They looked like footprints, but I couldn't imagine any human foot that big, and the toes looked not right. It was unsettling, but we were still trying to stay calm. We both knew there were black bears around, and I guess I tried to convince myself that's all it was, a bear that left a weird print. But Susan and I exchanged a nervous glance. Something felt wrong. We followed the tracks for a bit, just along the shore. It looked like whatever made them had come closer to my property line at some point. Broken branches were scattered around, low-hanging limbs twisted and snapped. The ground cover was disturbed. I'm no expert, but it looked like something big had moved through there recently. My heart was starting to pound, and I was annoyed at myself for feeling scared. I was supposed to feel safe out here, not freaked out by some weird footprints. Susan, who's usually tough as nails, started looking uneasy. She asked if I'd heard anything strange at night. I confessed that I'd heard these weird, distant howls a few times, but I never got out of bed to check. I mean, who would? Out here, you hear all kinds of weird things. Coyotes, owls, sometimes even foxes screaming. But these sounds had been different, more guttural and almost human-like. I hadn't dared to mention it earlier. But now, after seeing those tracks, it all started to feel connected. Susan's face tightened. We decided to head back to the house before it got dark. Around dusk, we were inside, double-checking that doors were locked and windows were closed. I remember feeling silly, like, what was I so afraid of? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like something was out there, leaning against a tree, silently observing us. Susan suggested we put on some music, try to relax. We turned on the lights outside, floodlights that lit up the yard and the path to the lake. It made me feel slightly safer, but only slightly. A few hours passed, and I was trying to focus on something else. Anything. I think we were looking at some property brochures Susan had brought. Then, out of nowhere, we heard it. A scream from the woods. It wasn't a woman's scream, and it sure as hell wasn't an animal I recognized. It sounded deep, pained, and angry all at once, like something that didn't belong in these woods. Susan froze. I stood up so fast I knocked my mug off the table, coffee spilling everywhere. Our eyes locked. And without saying a word, we both knew we weren't imagining things. I grabbed my truck keys. I'm not sure why I thought driving over there would help, but I guess I wanted the safety of a vehicle, and the headlights might scare off whatever was out there. Susan stayed inside, clutching the phone, ready to call someone if things got worse. I drove the truck slowly towards the lake, headlights cutting through the darkness, the radio on just loud enough so I wouldn't feel completely alone. The air had turned sour and thick, and I caught a smell that almost made me gag, like wet fur and rotten eggs. I'd never smelled anything like it. It was strong enough that I rolled up my windows and tried to breathe through my sleeve. When I reached the spot near the lake, the grass looked flattened in places, as if something massive had moved through there recently. I got out for just a second, just long enough to shine my flashlight around. I saw branches twisted, not broken off neatly, but almost wrenched apart. The smell was stronger here, and I swear I could feel eyes on me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. I don't know what I expected to see. A bear, a deer, maybe some drunk trespassers. But I saw nothing, just darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. I retreated back to the truck, reversed carefully, and headed back to the house. Susan was inside, pacing. She said after I'd left, she heard another scream, closer this time. She was shaking, not from cold, but from pure fear. We had no idea what to do. The police? What would we say? Hey, we heard some weird screams and found big footprints. But we called them anyway. I guess we needed to feel like we'd done something. The local officer who arrived looked tired, maybe a bit annoyed. He checked the area with his flashlight, told us it was probably a bear or a coyote. He didn't say much else. I could tell he didn't want to be out here for long. We walked behind him, staying close. The smell had faded by then, and the woods were dead silent. No rustling, no owls, nothing. It was as if whatever had been here was long gone. We showed him the footprints in the mud, but they were smudged and not as clear as before. He made some vague comment about large animals moving through at night and shrugged it off. I knew he wouldn't be filing any unusual report. After he left, Susan and I were alone again. We turned on every light inside and out. We triple-checked the locks. I kept my hunting rifle close by, even though I'm not much of a shooter. Just having it there made me feel slightly safer. We sat in the living room, barely talking, just listening. Every small noise made us jump. I kept expecting another scream, something slamming into the side of the house, or those weird footprints showing up right outside the window. But nothing happened. The rest of the night stretched on, tense and silent. Eventually, as the first hint of morning light began to show, we both realized that nothing more was going to happen. Whatever it was had either lost interest or moved on. But the fear didn't vanish. That experience left me with a knot in my stomach that never fully went away. To this day, I don't know what was out there. I've read stories online about things people call Bigfoot, or strange creatures lurking in the backwoods. I'm not saying that's what it was. I have no clue. All I know is that something big, something with a terrible smell and an eerie scream, was out there that day. It didn't care that we were human. It wasn't scared of us, or our lights, or our voices. It just left when it felt like it, leaving no proof other than my memories and a sense of dread. Susan never did build her house nearby. After that day, she gave up on the idea. She went back home and I stayed, but everything felt different. The quiet I'd wanted so badly now felt like a cover for something hidden, something I'll never understand. I still think about those footprints and that scream. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has felt those eyes watching from the woods. I wonder if it's still out there, just waiting for another quiet summer evening to let itself be known. But the truth is, I'll never know. That's the part that scares me the most. Story 6. I still remember that day in the summer of '71, like it just happened last week. Vivian and I had been staying in her family's old cabin near Ellensburg, out in Washington. We were there trying to find a new place to settle, using the cabin as a sort of temporary escape until we could figure out where to live permanently. The place was surrounded by thick forest, and I mean thick, tall pines, dense undergrowth, and these weird, quiet pockets where even the wind seemed hesitant to blow. We'd been there for a few days, enjoying the kind of peace you only get in the middle of nowhere. Mornings at the nearby lake, lazy afternoons on the porch, simple dinners by candlelight because the power flickered a lot in that old place. I'm not exactly a believer in the supernatural. I wasn't back then, and I'm still not now, but what happened that day still messes with my head. It started early in the morning, sometime before dawn. I woke up to this, I don't know, a feeling of something heavy moving outside. I'm a pretty light sleeper, and out there I was always half alert. There were weird noises at night sometimes, branches snapping, some animal howling in the distance, usual forest stuff. But this time I heard what sounded like something big walking around the cabin. Heavy steps. They weren't random either. They moved slowly, deliberately, circling the place. Vivian was still asleep, so I just lay there, holding my breath, listening. The steps would stop, and then I'd hear a subtle grunt or a low kind of muffled growl. It didn't sound like a bear to me. I'd heard bears before, and those sounds are more obvious, snorting or huffing. This was different. It had a pattern, almost like it was testing something, maybe testing us. After a few minutes, it went quiet. The sun came up slowly, lighting the room in that pale, early morning glow, and I decided I'd go outside. I didn't tell Vivian because I didn't want to worry her. I just said I'd fetch water from the lake. Outside, everything looked normal at first glance, but when I walked around the cabin, I spotted footprints. Not boot prints, not deer prints, nothing normal. These looked like gigantic bare footprints, only they weren't very clear, like whatever made them had huge, broad feet that barely pressed into the ground. The forest floor there was dense with pine needles, so tracks didn't come out crisp, but I could see displaced needles, a subtle outline. In some spots, branches had been snapped, not broken by weight falling on them, but twisted, like something tall had passed through and bent them aside. I tried to imagine a scenario. maybe a large animal, maybe a person wearing something odd. I couldn't piece it together, so I tried to shrug it off. Later that morning, Vivian and I decided to hike a bit deeper into the woods. We wanted to pick some berries she'd seen a few days before and maybe find a better view of the mountains. I remember the sunlight filtering through the trees and how quiet it was. It was the sort of silence that presses on your ears. We walked about 15 minutes from the cabin, and that's when I noticed something was off. Trees, big ones, looked as if they'd been pushed over, not blown down by storms or lightning, but shoved, roots half exposed, leaning at unnatural angles. I felt uneasy. Vivian noticed too. She kept scanning the tree line as if expecting someone to jump out. We whispered to each other, neither wanting to say aloud what we were thinking. We kept going until we reached a small clearing. That's when I saw them. Two huge, hairy figures standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 yards away. I caught them in my peripheral vision first. They were tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and covered in dark, matted hair. They moved smoothly, no stumbling, no noise, except a faint rustle of leaves. One of them turned its head slightly, and I swear I could feel its eyes on us. They didn't attack or charge. They just watched, like curious onlookers. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I'd get dizzy. Vivian gripped my arm, and I remember her fingernails digging into my skin. We both stood there, frozen, our breath shallow and silent. Then, just as quickly as I noticed them, they were gone. They slipped back into the forest with this eerie grace, vanishing behind the thick trunks. We didn't chase them. We just stood there, dumbfounded. It was so surreal it almost felt like a weird daydream. But I know it happened. We turned around and walked back to the cabin, trying to make sense of it, whispering frantic questions to each other. There was no conclusion, no explanation that fit nicely into something we already knew. Bears don't just stand upright and observe you from a distance like that. People in costumes, in that remote place in 1971. It didn't add up. Who'd hike all that way just to pull a prank and then vanish? And these things were too large and too natural. The way they blended into the forest was unnerving. By the time we got back, it was mid-afternoon. Vivian, who usually kept it together, looked rattled. We sat on the porch, and she had this idea, leave some food out in the woods, maybe as a peace offering. I didn't like the idea at first, but I didn't have a better plan. Maybe by doing that, we could see if whatever these things were might respond somehow. She put a basket of fruits and bread about 20 yards into the forest, right next to a fallen log. We went back inside and watched through the window for a while, but nothing happened, so we just tried to go on with our day. I remember making coffee on the old stove and trying to act like everything was normal. When evening came, we checked the spot. The basket was gone. Not just emptied, gone. We looked around and found it a few feet away, overturned and empty. There were no neat, human-like actions here. It looked like something had rummaged through it and taken what it wanted. No clear footprints this time, just disturbed leaves and that unsettling quiet. At that point, I was starting to feel like we were intruders in their territory, like we were tolerated but not exactly welcomed. Night fell fast. Around midnight, I woke up again to noises outside. Vivian was awake too, eyes wide in the darkness. It sounded like something was on the roof, walking slowly, making the boards creak. We had a small flashlight, and I remember hesitating before turning it on. I was afraid that shining a light would provoke whatever was out there. The steps stopped when I raised the flashlight. Then I heard a scratchy sound along the side of the cabin, like a big hand, or paw, or whatever, dragging slowly down the wall. My heart felt like it was lodged in my throat. I wanted to yell, to scare it off, but I was too terrified. Vivian was silent, holding my wrist so tight I lost feeling in my hand. The strangest part was that it never tried to break in. It never banged on the door or smashed a window. Instead, it felt like it was studying us, trying to understand who we were or what we were doing there. I sat in silence, every muscle tensed, just waiting for the sound of splintering wood or a growl that would mean real danger. But all I heard was shifting weight on the roof, a low, guttural breathing, and the occasional click of a branch being snapped off somewhere nearby. Eventually, the noises just stopped. No dramatic exit, no heavy footsteps disappearing into the night. One moment they were there, and then, as dawn lightened the sky, the forest sounded normal again. Birds chirping, leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Everything was back to how it had been before. We ventured outside at first light. No blood, no fur, no massive footprints this time. Just a lingering feeling of dread. It was as if we'd passed some kind of test, or maybe the creatures had lost interest. We didn't know, and honestly, we still don't. We left the cabin a few days later, moving on to Ellensburg to continue our house hunt. I've replayed that day in my mind countless times since then. I still can't find a rational explanation that fits all the details, the huge figures, the weird footprints, the heavy steps on the roof. I've tried telling myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe we misinterpreted what we saw, but that's just lying to myself. Those beings were real. I felt them there. I felt their presence, their gaze. I remember the smell too, like damp earth and wet animal fur lingering in the air after they were gone, something that stuck in my nose long after we left. I never reported it to any official source. What would I even say? That huge, hairy creatures were watching us, studying us in the woods outside Ellensburg in '71. I know how that sounds. But I also know what I saw and what I felt. Even now, decades later, I get chills thinking about that day. I've never experienced anything like it since, and part of me hopes I never do. It was there, it happened, and then it just stopped. To this day, I can't explain it, and that unsettles me more than anything else. Story 7. I still remember that day so clearly. It was late summer 1971, and we were still at that cabin near Ellensburg. I say we because I was there with Vivian, my partner. But that afternoon I had wandered off on my own for a bit. She was inside doing something, probably trying to keep her mind off the constant unease, and I was returning from the little lake nearby, hauling a bucket of water for our evening. I remember the sky was a pale blue, and the light was kind of flat, like the sun couldn't decide whether to shine hard or hide behind the thin clouds that were drifting in. We'd been leaving food out in a basket between the trees for a while, a ritual that started after our first strange encounter. Every morning, Vivian would quietly carry out a small offering, some fruit, some scraps, a bit of bread. The next day, it would be gone, with no signs of anything rummaging other than some faint impressions in the dirt, almost like large footprints, but never clear enough to be certain. We knew something was taking it. We knew it was probably one of those creatures we'd seen before, those tall, hairy shapes that moved through the woods like ghosts. For some reason, that routine had become normal to us. We'd accepted it. It was uneasy, sure, but it was also, well, it felt like a kind of understanding. We leave them food, and they don't mess with us. That day, as I walked back toward the cabin, I saw it again. One of them. It was standing off to the side of the clearing, partially hidden behind a large pine, but I caught the silhouette right away. My heart skipped a beat, but I wasn't as panicked as I'd been during our first encounter. Instead of ducking down or bolting back inside, I held my ground, tightening my grip on the bucket handle. The creature shifted slightly, then leaned its head forward, almost in a nod. That's what stuck with me. It recognized me. Its eyes, though partially shaded by thick brow ridges, seemed to meet mine. I actually think it knew who I was, that I was the one putting the basket out every day. There was a moment there, maybe 10 seconds, where we both just existed in silence, neither of us making a move. Then it turned and drifted between the fallen trunks and ferns, disappearing so smoothly that I had to question if I'd really seen it. My pulse was racing and my skin felt prickly. I didn't feel threatened exactly, but I was rattled. It's one thing to know these creatures are out there. It's another to realize they might know you back. Later that evening, Vivian and I were inside, trying to distract ourselves. I remember standing by the kitchen window, looking out at the thick darkness of the woods. Nights up there could be eerily quiet. Sometimes we'd hear owls or distant rustling, but on that night, it was like everything outside was holding its breath. Vivian had come up behind me to see what I was staring at. I had no idea what I was expecting to see, just felt uneasy, like something was about to happen. And then these lights appeared in the sky. I'm not talking about a plane or a star or anything we knew. They were these beams, thin, bright, and almost artificial, hanging above the treetops. They didn't flicker like flashlights, and they didn't move like searchlights. They just appeared, without sound, in a formation that made no sense. It was as if someone had turned on a switch in the sky. My skin broke out in goosebumps. I said something to Vivian under my breath. Maybe just her name. She pressed her forehead to the glass, trying to see more clearly. We stood like that, paralyzed, for maybe a minute or two, not sure what to do. Then I caught a glimpse of movement below those lights. One of them was out there again. One of those creatures, walking steadily toward a pale beam that came straight down from above. I couldn't see it fully. The trees obscured a lot, but I saw enough. Tall, broad shoulders, the same odd gait, the dark silhouette reflecting that weird glow. There was a moment when I swear I saw smaller lights around its body, tiny, shimmering points of color that didn't belong. They reminded me of Christmas lights, or fireflies in a pattern, but too structured, too deliberate. The creature moved right into that vertical beam of light, and for a split second, it looked like it was just standing there, illuminated from above by something I couldn't explain. I think I whispered something like, "What the hell is that?" to myself. My mouth went dry. Vivian's breathing turned shallow and fast. We didn't dare turn on any lights inside. We just stood there, glued to the window. Then, without any sound or warning, the lights in the sky blinked out. All at once. Gone, as if they had never been there. For a heartbeat, I could still see the silhouette of the creature, but then that vanished too. It was like a scene that had been playing in my mind just ended abruptly. The darkness slammed back into place, and I felt dizzy, like the world had been yanked out from under me. We stayed by that window for a long time, maybe half an hour, not talking much. I remember the tension in my shoulders and neck, the way my stomach felt hollow and uneasy. My senses went into overdrive. I listened for footsteps, for branches snapping, for anything that would confirm what we'd just seen was real. Nothing came. No noises, no lights, no creatures appearing at our door. The forest went back to being an ordinary forest at night, quiet, dark, and still. Eventually, we moved away from the window. I think we were both shaking a bit, though we tried to hide it from each other. There was no logical way to interpret what happened. We'd seen these creatures before, sure, but never with those bizarre lights. And what were those lights anyway? Something from above? Something not from here? Was this creature working with them, drawn to them, or was it just as perplexed as we were? I had no answers, and every time I tried to form a theory, it sounded absurd. Nothing else happened that night. No pounding on the walls, no strange calls from the woods, no sudden reappearances. It just ended. We eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep, both of us still shaken and full of questions that we never really resolved. The next morning, when I went outside, Everything looked normal. There was no trace of footprints, no bizarre marks where the light had touched the ground, nothing. It was as if the previous night had been a weird hallucination. But it wasn't. We both saw it. We both felt it. We never got an explanation, and over time, we just stopped talking about it as much. That day burned itself into my memory, and even now, so many years later, I still can't make sense of it. The forest was supposed to be a simple place, quiet, peaceful, and instead we got a glimpse of something that didn't fit any category I knew, something that involved these strange, large creatures and lights that came from nowhere. I don't have a satisfying conclusion. That's just what happened. We left that cabin at the end of the summer and returned to normal life, but I've never shaken the feeling that we saw something we weren't meant to see. Something that reminded me how little we understand about what's really out there in the dark. Story 8. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though we're talking about something that happened way back in the summer of 1952. I was just a kid then, maybe 13 or 14, and I spent most of my time running around the woods outside Wallace, California, with my friends. We were a small group of neighborhood boys, bored out of our minds and always looking for something new to explore. That day, we decided to hike deeper into the woods than usual, partly because we were hungry and wanted a quiet spot to eat lunch, and partly because we loved feeling like we were somewhere nobody else had been. The woods around Wallace weren't like thick, ancient forests you see in pictures. They were more open, with patches of tall, dry grass and clusters of trees, but as we ventured further, it got denser and quieter. We could still catch glimpses of the lake through the brush now and then, but mostly we just heard the creaking of branches and the distant sound of water slapping against the shoreline. I remember thinking it felt a bit off, like the woods were holding their breath. We were stomping around, kicking fallen branches and complaining about the heat. The plan was to find a little clearing to sit down and eat the sandwiches we'd brought. Then, just as we rounded a small slope, we got hit by this terrible smell. When I say terrible, I mean it made me gag. It smelled like something rotten, mixed with that musky odor you get when you pass by an old barn that's never cleaned. But this was more intense, thicker. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. None of us talked at first. We just slowed down, looking at each other with scrunched-up noses. It was too strong to ignore. We started following the smell, which in hindsight was a stupid thing to do, but we were kids, curious and always looking for a story to tell each other later. We thought maybe we'd find a dead deer or some animal that had crawled off and died. I remember stepping on something like a broken branch that cracked under my foot way too easily, almost like it was freshly snapped. Another friend noticed strange scuff marks in the dirt, like something big had dragged across it. We didn't know what to make of it. The ground was all torn up, some weeds flattened, and there were these weird impressions like large footprints, but not clearly shaped enough to say what made them. The smell got worse the closer we got to this spot. We started to see more broken branches, high ones, not the kind you break when you step on them. These were snapped at a height none of us kids could reach, even if we tried. It felt like something huge had moved through here recently, and not carefully. The area looked disturbed, as if something didn't belong and forced its way through. The air felt heavier, and I remember feeling my heart pounding. My friends looked nervous too. Nobody laughed or made jokes. We were too uncomfortable for that. We couldn't see any animal or corpse, no blood, no fur, nothing that would explain the smell. It was just this overturned patch of vegetation and strange marks that seemed random and yet somehow intentional. At one point, one of my buddies whispered, "What the hell could have done this?" I didn't have an answer, and I doubt anyone else did either. We just stood there, trying not to breathe too deeply because the stench was almost unbearable. We decided to go back and get an adult. We ran downhill to the lake, where my friend's uncle was fishing. He was a tough guy, always out on the water, knew the land better than most people around there. We hurried over to him, trying to explain what we found. We must have sounded nuts. There's something weird in the woods. It smells awful. The branches are broken. We saw these weird tracks. He probably thought we were making it up, but I think he could see the worry on our faces. We weren't screwing around. So he followed us back. We led him through the trees, trying to retrace our steps until we caught that smell again. It hadn't gone away. If anything, it lingered in the still air, like something huge had just passed through and left its stink behind. When we showed him the place, I watched his expression shift. He looked confused, maybe a bit uneasy, though he tried to hide it. He stepped around carefully, squatting down to look at the impressions on the ground. He glanced up at the broken branches overhead and then turned to us, looking more puzzled than I'd ever seen him. He didn't say much, just something along the lines of, "I've never seen anything like this." That's when I started to feel genuinely scared. This was a man who knew these woods inside and out. He could track deer, knew where the wild boars passed, could spot a bear's den from a distance. If he didn't know what it was, we sure as hell wouldn't figure it out on our own. We spent a few more minutes there, all of us standing in that weird patch of forest listening. I remember how quiet it was. No birds, no squirrels, just the faint rustle of leaves. It was like everything else in the woods had cleared out, leaving us alone with the aftermath of whatever made those marks. My skin was crawling. I kept expecting to see something huge and hairy step out from behind a tree, or feel a pair of eyes watching us from the underbrush. But we saw nothing. Just empty space where something big had obviously been. Eventually we left. The fisherman uncle didn't have any answers, just told us to keep it to ourselves until we could figure out what it might have been. He was too proud to admit he was scared, but I could see he was uneasy. As we walked back to the lake, I remember feeling relieved we were getting away from that smell and that disturbing scene. But it bothered me, not having an explanation. Even as a kid, I wanted to understand things like that. I wanted to know what could break branches so high off the ground and leave footprints that didn't quite look human or animal. Over the next few days, rumors spread quietly among some family and friends. People tried to give logical explanations. Maybe an old bear, maybe some sick animal with mange. Someone even said a gorilla had escaped from a traveling circus years ago, which sounded like complete nonsense to me. But the strangest theories were the ones that hinted at some sort of wild man living in the forest. I heard older folks mention stories passed down from earlier generations about seeing large, hairy figures at a distance or hearing strange howls at night. None of us boys had taken those old tales seriously before, but now I couldn't stop thinking about them. We went back another time, just a few of us, trying to find the exact spot. But the woods looked different without that overpowering smell. We found similar broken branches a short distance away and some more weird impressions in the ground, but nothing as dramatic as before. It was like the forest had swallowed up the evidence just enough to make us doubt what we'd seen. Without the stench and that initial shock, it was harder to be sure we weren't just getting ourselves worked up over nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I know what I smelled, and I know what I saw. And I know that the fisherman uncle, someone I trusted to know these woods, was left scratching his head. He never admitted it, but I saw the look on his face that day. He wasn't just puzzled, he was disturbed. I still think about that afternoon sometimes, even now. Back then, we had never heard the term Bigfoot or Sasquatch. That came later, when reports started popping up in different parts of the country. When I heard those stories, my mind immediately went back to that summer in 1952. I can't prove we stumbled onto something like that, but I can't shake the feeling that we did. We never found a carcass, never saw a creature directly, never got anything concrete. Just that awful smell, those broken branches, the strange footprints, and that heavy silence that made the forest feel wrong. No one ever came forward with a solid explanation. Over time, people stopped asking about it, and the story faded into a kind of local folklore. I guess all I can say is I was there, and I know something happened, something big, something strange, and I've never been able to explain it. It started out of nowhere and ended just as suddenly. I never smelled that stench again, never saw those weird trails, and never heard any official account of what it might have been. To this day, I still get chills when I think about it. I can't shake the feeling that we got too close to something we weren't supposed to see, something that slipped back into the shadows as quickly as it appeared. I wish I had answers, but I don't. All I have is the memory of that unsettling afternoon and the uneasy knot it still ties in my stomach. Story 9. I remember that summer in 2004 when a bunch of us ended up near Dunsmuir, California. We were a loose group of friends, some with weird nicknames like Roy Artop, Sparkles, and Scott. We had been traveling around, hitchhiking, sleeping outdoors, just sort of drifting through the northern part of the state. We found this spot to camp near a river, somewhere out of the way, tucked in the woods. It was a good spot. The river was loud, rushing over rocks, and the place felt hidden. For about a week, we settled in, cooking our meals over a small fire and talking late into the night until we fell asleep in our sleeping bags, just under the open sky. The nights were usually calm, except for the sound of the water. The wind would move through the branches, but it never felt eerie. It felt like nature was cradling us, if that makes sense. We were dirty, a little hungry sometimes, but mostly just free. I still remember how the ground smelled faintly of wet leaves and moss, how the smoke from our fire mixed with the crisp nighttime air. By day, we could walk along the river, try to catch some fish, or just hang out and talk about nothing. The area around Dunsmuir felt oddly welcoming. It's a picturesque, almost sleepy place, but it has this deep forest feeling that makes you think there's more going on behind the green curtain of leaves. One particular night, though, changed my whole perspective. I can't say I ever fully understood what happened, but I know what I saw. Most of the group had crashed early, probably worn out from a day of exploring, maybe a bit buzzed from cheap beer we'd managed to pick up. It was late, well past midnight. I was having trouble sleeping. I think I had too much caffeine or something before turning in. My sleeping bag was a few steps away from our small dying fire, and I remember just staring up at the moon. The moonlight was bright that night. It cut through the trees and made these strange shadows on the ground. The sound of the river was constant, like static from a TV left on in another room. I rolled onto my side and noticed something moving at the edge of our camp. At first, I figured it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. Deer would sometimes come near the camp looking for scraps or just passing through. But as I looked closer, I realized it stood upright. Not like a deer rearing up or something, but like a person. It was tall, hunched slightly forward, and covered in what looked like dark hair. I could see the shape of a head, broad shoulders and long arms. It moved slowly, deliberately, and incredibly quietly. Despite the dry twigs and leaves, I didn't hear a single crack or rustle. It was like it glided through the underbrush. My heart started pounding. I remember feeling this weird tension in my chest, like I couldn't breathe right. I didn't want to make any noise, and I was terrified if I moved too much it would notice me. It wasn't more than a few yards away from where we slept. It was close enough that I could pick out the slight texture of its coat in the moonlight. I tried to tell myself maybe it was some guy wearing a strange outfit, maybe a mountain hermit or someone who lived off-grid. But it didn't look right. Its limbs were too long. Its body shape didn't match any person I'd ever seen. I didn't smell anything odd, and it didn't make any sound. It just moved through the shadows, pausing every now and then as if scanning the area. I could see everyone else completely oblivious, rolled up in their sleeping bags, gently snoring or breathing heavily. I wondered if I should call out, but part of me was afraid to break that heavy silence. It didn't feel threatening exactly, but it was beyond unsettling. I've been around bears before, and this was no bear. I've seen big guys with tons of hair and unkempt beards, but this was something else. It moved too smoothly, and there was a natural ease to its presence, as if it belonged there, more than we ever could. I watched it step carefully towards a small ravine, just a bit further down the slope near the trees. There was a thick patch of vegetation there. As it moved, the moonlight hit it in a way that let me see its profile for a second. Broad chest, arms that hung a bit lower than a human's would, a slight dome to the head. It never looked directly at me, or if it did, it didn't show any reaction. Instead, it just disappeared down that ravine. 1 second it was there, and the next, gone. The whole thing probably lasted less than a minute, but it felt like ages. I lay there, heart hammering in my ears. I half expected to hear a scream or a grunt, some parting sound that would confirm what I saw. But nothing came, just the river's roar and the distant whisper of leaves. Eventually, I mustered up the courage to sit up. I scanned the tree line. Nothing, no movement, no figure. I could still feel that presence, though, like an afterimage burned into my mind. It didn't feel like a hallucination. I had been wide awake, no substances that would cause something like that. And I've never been prone to wild imagination, at least not enough to conjure something that solid and real. I spent the rest of the night half awake, unable to relax. Every time a branch moved or a leaf fell, I tensed up, expecting to see it reappear. But it never did. When morning finally came, the first thing I did was tell the others what I'd seen. As expected, they had mixed reactions. Sparkles just laughed and shrugged it off as me being tired and seeing shadows. Scott looked thoughtful, but said nothing. Rui Artop kind of raised an eyebrow and said something like, "That's weird," but didn't offer much else. They were more annoyed I'd woken them up early with my story than actually concerned. They didn't say I was lying, but they sure didn't jump on my side either. I tried to explain the details, the way it moved, how quiet it was, how it definitely wasn't just a normal hiker or camper. We were in a remote spot, and who would wander around at that hour in some hairy costume? No one else heard or saw anything. No footprints, no broken branches. Maybe the ground was too hard. The only sound we all had was the river, which might have masked any noise. But still, it was too close not to have been noticed by someone else. We spent that morning circling the spot where I'd seen it. The vegetation was thick, the ground damp. There were some impressions in the soil, but nothing conclusive. It could have been anything, just irregularities in the forest floor. I kept replaying the moment in my head. I remember the exact shape of its silhouette, the slight sway of its upper body as it moved downhill, the strange calmness about it. I can't forget the feeling I had, like my body was full of electricity. Even thinking about it now makes my heart race. As we sat around that morning's fire, we started talking about local stories we'd heard. Not that we knew any official legends, but we all knew the common tales. Big, hairy creatures rumored to roam the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, call it what you want. We never took those stories seriously. They were always good campfire material, the stuff you laugh about before sleeping. But seeing something like that, even if just for a brief minute, changes how you think. Suddenly, the impossible starts to feel a lot less impossible. The thing is, I never felt threatened. The creature, if that's what it was, seemed almost cautious, maybe curious, but not aggressive. It didn't bare teeth or make noise. It didn't throw stones or try to scare us off. It simply passed by. For all I know, it had been watching us for days, waiting for the right moment when we were all asleep to slip by unnoticed. Maybe it didn't want anything to do with us. Maybe we were just intruders, and it was going about its business. The forest around Dunsmuir is old and vast, and who knows what really lives in those hidden pockets. After that day, I never got a solid explanation. We stayed a bit longer, and nothing else strange happened. Eventually, we moved on, caught more rides, ended up somewhere else. But I never forgot the sight of that figure. To this day, I can't say with certainty what I encountered. Was it really what people call Bigfoot? Or just a strange person in some kind of suit? I saw no reason for a prank. There were no other campers around to amuse. And the way it moved just didn't fit a human being pretending. I still leaned towards something unknown. These years later, I still picture that moment under the moon. The way the world seemed to hush around me, like I was witnessing something not meant for my eyes. When I close my eyes, I can still see that broad shape blending into the darkness, still hear the pounding of my heart and the relentless rush of that river. Since then, I've tried to rationalize it, but I've never found a neat explanation. No matter how I slice it, the memory remains raw and unnerving. I guess that's what's so unsettling. It never came back, never revealed itself again, never gave me any closure. It was just one strange, silent encounter in the middle of nowhere. Afterward, everything went back to normal, as if it never happened. But I know what I saw, and no matter how many times I tell myself I might have been mistaken, I can't shake that feeling. It's a reminder that the world isn't as straightforward as we pretend it is. There's always something lurking beyond what we understand, and sometimes, if you're unlucky or lucky enough, you get a brief, haunting glimpse. Story 10. I was about 15 at the time, back in the summer of 1970, when my cousin and I decided to head out into the woods near Eugene, Oregon. We were bored kids, you know, always looking for some little thrill. We had these small dirt bikes we'd saved up for, and we'd ride out into the forest trails, kicking up dust and weaving between tall pines. That day started off like any other. Warm air, buzzing insects, the dry scent of pine needles everywhere. We weren't expecting anything strange. We'd done this a dozen times before. But looking back, I still get this tight feeling in my chest when I remember what happened out there. I recall us finding this path that was less traveled, the kind where the undergrowth started creeping in, and the sounds of the main trails faded behind us. The dirt was softer, and there were patches of ferns and thicker shrubs. It got quieter the deeper we went, and the only noise was the hum of our engines and the rustling of leaves as we passed. After a while, we slowed down near this more secluded section. The air felt different, heavier, I guess, and I remember my cousin pointing to a cluster of dense bushes off to our left. That's when we both noticed the smell. God, it was awful, like a mix of wet dog and rotten vegetation. At first, I thought maybe we'd stumbled across something dead, some animal carcass hidden in the brush. It was pungent enough to make me cover my nose with my sleeve. We let the bikes idle, just trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. I shut off my engine to listen, and my cousin followed suit. Without the bikes running, the silence was unnerving. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of the forest. It felt like something was watching us. My heart rate picked up, but I didn't want to admit it to myself right then. We walked our bikes a few steps forward, pushing through some low branches. The smell got stronger, more intense, and then we spotted it. The figure stood about maybe 4 feet tall, hard to be exact because it was crouched slightly. It was covered in dark, matted hair, except around what looked like its face and maybe the hands. I remember its eyes, big, dark, and curious, locked right onto us. It wasn't charging or growling or anything, it was just there. A small creature, like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was definitely not a bear cub that I knew. Bears have a certain shape, a certain face. This thing's face was more human-looking, Not human exactly, but closer to it than a bear or a monkey. I couldn't wrap my head around it at that moment. My cousin and I just stared. I could feel my skin crawling, and I wanted to say something, but it felt like words got stuck in my throat. The creature's eyes were so alive, so aware. It wasn't some dumb animal caught off guard. It seemed to be thinking. That freaked me out more than anything. The intelligence in those eyes, the way it seemed to be sizing us up, trying to understand what we were. We were maybe 20 feet away, maybe less, just separated by some branches and thin foliage. The creature stood near the edge of a slightly thicker patch of forest. We stared at it, and it stared back. I got goosebumps all over, and I remember thinking how strange it felt that there was no aggression, but also no fear on its part. It just stood there, as if hoping not to be noticed despite being right in front of us. I remember the sunlight filtering through the needles of the pines, making patterns on its fur. And there was that smell again, definitely coming from it or something close by. Then came this deep, resonant sound from behind it. Not a roar exactly, but a low rumble, like a very large animal exhaling loudly, almost like a warning. I couldn't see what made the sound, but I knew it came from deeper in the trees behind this small creature. My cousin and I flinched. That noise made my heart skip. It reminded me that even though this thing in front of us was small, it might not be alone. Maybe its parent or whatever it belonged to was just a few feet behind, hidden by the shadows. That thought made my stomach twist. As soon as the creature heard that noise, it darted off, disappearing into the thicker part of the forest. And when I say darted, I mean it moved fast, way faster than I could have run through that kind of terrain. It was just gone, leaving us standing there like idiots. One moment we were locked in this weird standoff, and the next we were staring at empty brush. I don't know what I expected. Maybe for it to move like an animal I knew, with a sort of predictable gait. But its motion was different, eerily smooth and agile. It vanished without a trace, and just like that, we were alone again. I remember the feeling in my gut after it left. Confusion, fear, excitement, disbelief, all tangled up. The forest suddenly felt colder. My cousin muttered something under his breath, but I didn't really register it. We both felt like we'd just witnessed something we couldn't process. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there, that we'd stumbled into a place where we shouldn't have been, and had a face-to-face encounter with something that wasn't ready to be seen by us. We lingered for maybe another minute, listening, trying to catch any sound of it. There was nothing, no snapping twigs, no rustling branches, no heavy footsteps. Just silence, and that lingering stench that seemed to cling to the air. We didn't talk much right then. We got back on our bikes and carefully headed out. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see it again, or to see something bigger lurking in the distance, but I never did. By the time we got out of the woods and back onto more familiar trails, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. At that age, I didn't know anything about legends or creatures people later started calling Bigfoot. We had no frame of reference. We told my aunt and uncle what happened when we got back that day. They gave us those looks adults give when they think kids are making up stories. We could tell they didn't believe us. My cousin tried to describe the smell, the eyes, but it just sounded like we were spinning tales. We gave up after a while. Over time, as these stories of strange ape-like creatures in the forests of the Pacific Northwest started popping up, we'd look at each other knowingly. We became sure we saw a juvenile one, or at least something along those lines. We never got any proof, no footprints we could show off, no photos. Just that weird encounter, stuck in my memory. To this day, the details are vivid. The way it stood there, the way it looked at us like it was as shocked as we were. The way the forest went dead quiet before it happened and after it left. I still don't know what we saw that afternoon. I don't know if anyone will ever be able to explain it. We weren't hurt, we weren't chased, we weren't attacked. It just happened, then ended. There's a part of me that wishes I could have followed it, to see where it went, but the truth is, I was too scared. And maybe that was the right call, because as unsettling as it was to witness something like that, the idea of meeting its full-grown kin, or whatever made that low, rumbling sound, still sends a chill through me, even all these decades later. In all the years since, I've never seen anything like it again. Nothing comes close to that day. But when I remember that smell and those eyes, I feel that same uneasy feeling, like I brushed against some secret in the world that's still out there, hidden by the pines. And I'll never be able to explain it in a way that feels complete, not to anyone else, not even to myself. It just happened, and then it was gone. Story 11. Back in the summer of 1983, I went on a camping trip with my wife and our 2 young daughters near a remote lake outside of Bend, Oregon. We were looking for a quiet escape, just a few days to fish and let the kids play in the shallow parts of the water. My wife and I had done a bit of camping before, and this spot seemed perfect. Out of the way, peaceful, surrounded by thick woods. The days were warm, the nights chilly and silent. Honestly, I didn't expect anything more than a relaxing time with my family. It was sometime well into the night, probably after midnight, when I woke up to the sound of something breaking. It sounded like glass shattering, but I couldn't place where it came from. Inside our tent, everything was still. My wife was asleep. The kids were tucked in their sleeping bags. I remember lying there, holding my breath, straining my ears. Our dogs were nowhere to be heard. These were 2 large, trained guard dogs, and it was completely unlike them not to at least rustle or growl at any unusual sound outside. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent carefully, trying not to make noise. The night air hit me, and it was cold. I had a small flashlight in one hand and a larger camping lantern in the other. Normally out there, I'd hear crickets or maybe an owl in the distance, but it was dead quiet. It was like the whole forest around us had paused. That silence made the hair stand up on my arms. I swung the beam of my flashlight around, looking for the source of the broken glass. We'd had a few bottles of soda on the makeshift picnic table near our campfire ring. The fire was down to glowing coals, so I had to rely on the flashlight. I expected to see an animal rummaging around, maybe a raccoon or even a black bear. But there was nothing. Just that strange silence. I caught a slight movement out of the corner of my eye and turned the light toward our vehicle. Our dogs were inside it. They weren't barking or yelping. They were just there, pressed low on the seats, trembling. I know it sounds odd, but seeing them that scared rattled me more than the silence. These dogs were tough. They'd chased off all kinds of animals before, coyotes, even a bear once. But now they were cowering like puppies, refusing to come out. I moved closer to the car, whispering to them, but they wouldn't budge. They just stared back at me with wide eyes, as if warning me not to go any further. I couldn't smell anything unusual right then, just the damp earth and the faint smoke from the dying fire. I circled the perimeter of our campsite, shining the flashlight into the trees. Still nothing. No movement, no eyeshine, no sounds. At some point I realized that every normal nighttime noise had vanished. Even the breeze seemed to have stopped. It's hard to explain, but I felt this pressure in the air, like something heavy was waiting just beyond my line of sight. I thought maybe it was a big predator, like a cougar watching us. But the dogs had seen cougars before, and they didn't react like this. They would bark and snarl if it were just a normal predator. Eventually, I tried to relax, telling myself maybe a branch had fallen and hit one of the bottles. Maybe I imagined the glass sound. Maybe I was overreacting. I forced myself to check around once more. I didn't go too deep into the woods, just a few steps beyond the edge of our campsite. That's when I noticed something strange. There were these odd marks on the ground near the tree line. I couldn't make out a perfect shape, just large, vague impressions, too big to be human footprints and spaced in a way that didn't feel right for a bear. I knelt down and ran my hand over the soil. It was soft from recent rain, so any heavy step would leave a good mark. These prints didn't have a clear shape I could easily identify. They were just big. I remember feeling my stomach tighten. We had heard stories, everyone has, but I had always rolled my eyes at them. Still, standing there feeling watched, I couldn't shake the idea that these prints didn't belong to something normal. I backed up slowly, keeping the flashlight scanning in front of me. That's when I got a whiff of something. It's tough to describe, but it was a strong, musky odor with a sour edge to it, like wet animal fur mixed with stagnant water and something else, maybe rotting vegetation. It was thick enough to make me swallow hard and breathe through my mouth. The smell didn't stay long. It drifted away almost as soon as I noticed it, as if something large had just passed by, and I caught its lingering scent. I headed back to the tent, feeling more confused than terrified at that point, but definitely unsettled. I checked on my family. Everyone was still asleep, blissfully unaware of how strange the outside world felt. I lingered by the flap of the tent, flashlight off, just listening. The silence was so complete, it was almost humming. That's the only way I can put it. Like my ears were searching for sounds that just weren't there. I must have stood there for at least an hour, waiting for another noise, another sign. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down. I held the lantern close, but I never really closed my eyes. I just listened, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No branches snapped, no growls, no rustling in the bushes. The silence held me hostage until the sky finally started to lighten. When dawn came, the forest slowly woke up again. Birds started chirping, a breeze picked up, and my dogs finally worked up the courage to leave the car. I examined the spot where I'd found those strange impressions the night before. The ground was scuffed up, and some branches on a pine tree were broken at a height I couldn't reach, even if I stood on my tiptoes. Whatever had been there must have been tall and strong, but what gets me even now is that nothing was missing. Our food, our supplies, everything was untouched. It was like something had just passed through, left its mark, scared the hell out of us, and then moved on. My wife asked why the dogs had been in the car. I tried to explain, but I didn't have a real answer. The broken glass turned out to be one of the soda bottles that had fallen off the table and shattered. Maybe something had pushed it, or maybe the bottle rolled off somehow. I could never be certain. I tried to brush it off, but as we packed up later that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were watched. Not threatened exactly, but observed, like a curious onlooker who chose not to reveal itself. To this day, I can't fully explain what happened that night. I've come across stories later on, accounts of big, hairy, human-like creatures in the northwest woods. People call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I wasn't a believer before, and I'm still not sure what I believe now. All I know is that night felt different from any other. The silence, the smells, the dog's reaction, the strange footprints. None of it added up to any animal I know. We left that campsite without any clear answers. We didn't stick around to test our luck. Nothing else weird happened on our way out, and we never saw anything that morning. It was as if the world went back to normal as soon as the sun rose. But I remember every detail of that night clearly. Even now, all these years later, I still get chills thinking about how those woods felt. Like something big was out there, something I couldn't understand, watching us and then slipping away before dawn. It's not a comfortable memory, but it's one I can't shake. and I guess I never will. Story 12. I remember it was a late spring night in 1975, near the Lummi community in Washington. I lived alone back then, in a small wooden house tucked at the edge of the forest. It was a quiet place. I mean, really quiet, especially after sunset, when the frogs and crickets took over, and the distant sound of water flowing in the creek behind my backyard was usually the only thing keeping me company. That night, though, something felt off, even before I went to bed. It's hard to explain, but the air felt heavier, like the trees were holding their breath. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was used to solitude, and odd feelings come and go when you're by yourself. I went to sleep earlier than usual, trying to get some rest because I'd been having trouble with my old hip. It must have been around 2 or 3 in the morning when I woke up suddenly, heart pounding in my ears. At first, I thought I'd dreamt it, but then I heard it again. A rattling sound at my front door, like someone carefully testing the handle. My house wasn't fancy, just a single front door with a wooden frame and a flimsy outer screen door. I could hear that metal screen squeak as if it were being tugged from outside. My stomach knotted. I lived alone, and I didn't have many neighbors close by, just a few houses spread out along the old logging road. I pulled myself out of bed, moved slowly and quietly to my living room, and turned on a small lamp. I stood there in my nightgown, heart racing, wondering if maybe a drunken neighbor had wandered onto my property. But it didn't fit. Nobody I knew would try to get in at this hour, and definitely not in such a weird, deliberate way. They would have knocked, called my name, something. What I heard was more like someone trying to figure out how the door worked. It was subtle, but you know that feeling when you just sense there's someone right on the other side. I leaned in close enough to peek through the thin curtain over the small window by the door. Outside, it was pitch black. I had a porch light, but it only covered a tiny patch, leaving everything else swallowed by darkness. I couldn't see anyone clearly, but I heard breathing, heavy, steady breathing, not panting, not talking, just this low, steady huff every few seconds. I swear I could feel it through the wood. My skin prickled, and I noticed an odd smell seeping in, a strong, musky odor that wasn't familiar at all. It wasn't like a skunk or a wet dog. It was sharper, more sour. Honestly, it made me feel nauseous. By now, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it'd wake the whole forest. I had an old rotary phone on a small table near my armchair. I tiptoed back, keeping my eyes on the door, and carefully dialed the local police. I tried to keep my voice calm, but I'm sure I sounded terrified. The dispatcher said they'd send an officer. I stayed on the line, waiting, barely speaking, just listening to that damn door handle. It kept jiggling, not aggressively, but persistently, like whoever was out there wouldn't give up until they got inside. I'm not some frail woman who jumps at every sound. I'd spent many years in that house and knew the local wildlife pretty well. I'd dealt with raccoons, deer, and even a black bear once that got into my trash. But none of them ever tried to turn my doorknob. Animals scratch, they paw, they sniff around. They don't try to manipulate the handle like this. It felt wrong. It felt like something that understood more than it should. Within about 20 minutes, I saw the faint glow of headlights bouncing off the trees outside my front window. The rattling stopped instantly. Just stopped. It was dead silent. I heard my gravel driveway crunch as the police cruiser parked. I cracked the door open just enough to talk through it, relief washing over me when I saw the uniform on the other side. The officer was a younger guy, local, someone who'd probably grown up around there. He took one look at me, shaking, pale, and immediately turned his flashlight to examine the door. We both saw the damage right away. The wooden frame around the door was slightly splintered, like it had been pulled on or twisted with more strength than a normal person would use. The outer screen, which was supposed to be latched, was partially torn. You could see marks where something had gripped it hard. I remember the officer shining his flashlight down at the ground, then crouching to look more closely. He didn't say much at first, but I saw him run his fingers over the cracks in the wood, and then he looked back at me with a puzzled expression. He asked if I'd seen who did it. I told him no, that I only heard and smelled something strange. The weirdest thing was that nothing inside the house was missing. I kept expecting to find my porch ransacked or something stolen, but no. Everything was where I left it. It's like whoever it was just wanted in, but hadn't gotten that far yet. The policeman walked around the side of the house, shining his flashlight into the trees. He didn't go too far. It was night, and the forest gets intimidating even for cops. He came back after a few minutes and said he couldn't see anyone lurking around. But he mentioned something strange. The ground was soft from recent rain, and he'd noticed some impressions near my porch steps. Large impressions, bigger than a human foot. He wouldn't commit to anything. He suggested maybe it was a prankster, maybe an animal trying to get at something it smelled inside, but I could tell he wasn't convinced by his own words. He advised me to keep my doors locked, maybe get a sturdier lock or some outside lights. After that he left, promising to drive through the area a couple more times before sunrise. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. The smell lingered in my nostrils, that unpleasant, musky odor. And now I felt watched. It's an awful feeling, knowing something is out there, hidden in the woods, maybe still hungry or curious enough to come back. I turned on every light inside the house. I pulled a chair up to the window so I could keep an eye on the tree line. Hours passed, maybe 1 or 2, and I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I caught myself jerking awake, the house quiet and still. Then I heard a new sound, coming from the darkness beyond my yard, a sort of low whistle, followed by a deep grunt. It wasn't human, but it wasn't quite animal either. It made my skin crawl. It sounded like something trying to communicate in a way I didn't understand. I turned off my lamp so it wouldn't see me through the window. Peering out, I could barely make out the shapes of bushes and tree trunks. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed a tall, dark shape standing very still about 30 or 40 feet away, partially hidden behind some shrubs. It was massive, taller than any man, and broad. I couldn't see details, just a big, bulky silhouette. Then it moved, sinking lower, as if crouching down, trying to remain hidden. The smoothness of its movement was shocking for something that large. I held my breath, terrified that if I made a sound, it would rush at the house again. I wanted to call the police back, but I was afraid if I moved away from the window, it would vanish without a trace. I know this sounds crazy, but I had this intense need to know what it was, at least see it a bit better. After a few minutes, my fear got the best of me, and I carefully backed away from the window and grabbed the phone again. This time, the dispatcher didn't sound thrilled to hear from me. They told me an officer had already checked the property, and that unless there was immediate danger, I'd have to wait until morning for another patrol. I didn't blame them, I guess. These were quiet parts. Maybe they thought I was just a nervous old lady. I went back to the window, and that's when I noticed it was gone. The shape, whatever it was, had vanished without making a single sound, not even leaves rustling. That silence spooked me more than if it had roared and charged. The idea that something that size could move away so quietly made me feel utterly powerless. I turned on my porch light again, desperately hoping it would keep it at bay, but of course, the light only penetrated a few feet into the darkness. I spent the rest of the night on edge, listening to every small sound. Occasionally, I'd catch a distant grunt or a short, sharp whistle echoing from the woods, but it never came back up to the house. Eventually, the sky started to lighten. I stepped outside cautiously at dawn, a thick sweater over my nightgown, and looked around. The forest smelled normal again, no strange musk. The ground was damp, and in that soft earth I saw footprints that were impossible to ignore. They looked like huge human footprints, but easily twice the size, with a stride longer than any man I'd ever known could manage. They led from my porch steps into the trees. That was it. No other sign. It was like it had simply appeared and then disappeared back into the wilderness. Later that morning, a neighbor who lived about a quarter-mile away stopped by. He asked if I'd heard anything strange during the night. I just nodded. He said he'd heard weird whistles and something walking around near his goat pen but couldn't see a thing. He looked uneasy, muttered something about large animals and left. I didn't push him for details. Maybe he didn't want to sound crazy either. I never got a definitive answer for what happened that night. The police came by again later, looked at my door, shrugged, and said it could have been someone trying to break in. But they couldn't explain the footprints or the strange sounds. The old stories I'd heard from some local folks, the rumors of these forest men, tall and hair-covered beings that kept to themselves, suddenly didn't sound so far-fetched. I'm not saying I know exactly what it was. I just know it wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't a regular trespasser. Whoever or whatever it was seemed smart enough to try the doorknob and quiet enough to slip away without a trace. In the days and weeks that followed, things died down. I reinforced the door, put in some brighter porch lights, and tried to go about my life. I never saw it again, but I never forgot it either. Even now, I can recall the sound of that doorknob rattling, the heavy breathing on the other side of the door, and that foul, sour smell. It all started and ended that night. No dramatic encounter after that, no final showdown. Just a brief, terrifying moment of contact with something I still don't understand. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just telling you what I experienced. That night changed the way I look at the forest around here. It reminded me that there are still things out there that don't fit neatly into what we know. And after all these years, I still get chills thinking about it. I've never been able to explain it, and maybe I never will. Story 13. I remember it was the summer of 1988, and I was 12 years old at the time. We lived near Abedine, Washington, in a pretty quiet rural area. I used to spend a lot of my free time exploring the creeks and little fishing spots around there, mostly because there just wasn't much else to do. That day, I'd gotten up early, before the sun was really strong, and ridden my old bike out to this small stream about 10 minutes from my house. I had a simple plan: catch some crawfish under the rocks and bring them home just to show my parents that I could. I was always trying to prove I wasn't just some kid who stayed indoors all day. The spot I chose was surrounded by thick vegetation. It wasn't like a cleared hiking trail or anything. I had to push through some ferns and step over roots to get down to the water. I remember I propped my bike against a tree, just one of those tall pines that seem to be everywhere around there, and then I started looking for crawfish. I loved that feeling of cold water on my hands as I lifted the stones, checking the dark spaces underneath for a claw sticking out. The morning air was still cool, and I could hear distant bird calls, but aside from that, there wasn't much noise, just the gentle rush of the stream. I was so focused on what I was doing that it took me a moment to notice something was off. I don't know how to explain it well, but it was like a pressure, like the kind of feeling you get when you realize you're not alone. So I stopped what I was doing and slowly looked up, scanning the tree line. At first, I didn't see anything, just ferns, moss, branches, the usual. But then, about 20 steps away, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, there was this figure standing there. It was definitely not just a stump or a bush. It was a figure, upright, covered in this sort of pale, off-white or light greyish hair. The hair was long, and it covered most of its body. It wasn't like a clean, uniform coat. It looked kind of uneven, but not messy, just natural. I froze. My heart felt like it got lodged in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. It was tall taller than any adult I knew at the time, but not freakishly enormous. Still, it had a size and presence that was unsettling. The arms were what got me. They looked longer than normal human arms, hanging lower in a way that didn't feel right. Its face wasn't fully visible, but I could make out that near its nose and eyes, the hair seemed a bit thinner, showing some pinkish skin. The nose was kind of flat, and the eyes just stared right at me. There was no sound, no grunting or growling. It just stood there, watching. I remember being terrified, but also strangely fascinated. It didn't look like a bear standing upright. I'd seen bears before from a distance, and their shape is different. This was more, I don't know, more human-like in posture, or at least something close. I wanted to move, but I was scared if I did something sudden, it would react. I also remember the air feeling heavier, like I was suddenly aware that everything around me was alive and watching. The birds had gone quiet. Even the trickle of the stream seemed muted, like my ears were focusing on this one presence. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. I think I might have made a small sound, maybe a nervous exhale or a quiet gasp, something I couldn't hold in. Right when I did that, the creature tilted its head slightly, almost as if acknowledging I was a person, not just another animal rummaging in the water. That tiny movement somehow felt more alarming than if it had just stayed still. It was like a sign of intelligence or curiosity, and that made it way more unsettling. This wasn't just some dumb forest animal stumbling into my spot. We just stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably just a few seconds. Time got weird. My legs were shaking, though I tried to hold them steady. I wanted to run, but I also wanted to see what would happen next. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure it could hear it. I had no idea what to do. I felt completely exposed, like a trespasser. For a kid who was used to feeling safe in those woods, it was a strange and paralyzing sensation. The sun was higher now, and patches of light fell on the leaves, giving everything that morning glow. Except this moment didn't feel warm at all. It felt tense and eerie. Then, slowly, it started to move back. It didn't turn around like a person might. It just stepped back into the thicker brush, still facing me, and sort of faded into the greenery. Its hair blended in with the pale bark of some trees and the lighter patches of leaves. In a matter of seconds, it was gone. I didn't hear footsteps like you might expect. No snapping branches or heavy breathing, nothing, just quiet. I stood there, my legs locked, water dripping from my fingers. I kept looking, waiting for it to come out again, to rush at me, to do something. But it never did. Eventually, I realized I was holding my breath. I let out a shaky exhale and felt my stomach twist. I remember feeling kind of dizzy and stupidly wondering if I'd just seen some kind of ghost, or maybe I was still asleep. But I knew I wasn't dreaming. Everything was too sharp, the smell of wet earth, the chill of the water against my skin. That was real, and whatever I had seen was real too, at least as real as anything else out there. I didn't stay much longer. I splashed some water on my face, grabbed my bike, and rode home as fast as I could. I tried to act normal walking into the house, but I'm pretty sure my parents could tell something was off. I told them what happened, expecting them to take me seriously, but they just looked at each other and gave me those half-smiles parents give when they think their kid is making up a story. My dad even said it was probably just a bear I startled. But I know what a bear looks like, even a bear on its hind legs. This was different. It had a presence I can't really put into words. It had a certain awareness. Over the years, I came across people talking about Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest, especially around Washington. It made me think back to that morning. At the time, I didn't know what to call it. I had no idea there were other stories like this. But looking back, it fits the descriptions people give. The problem is, whenever I've tried to explain it, I get the same reaction. People think I was a kid with an overactive imagination. That's fine. I know what I saw. To this day, I can't shake that feeling I had, locked in that strange staring contest. It's like I stumbled onto something that wasn't meant to be seen, or at least not often. The forest around Abedine holds a lot of secrets, and I think I got a glimpse of one that morning. I'm older now, but I still remember every detail. The pale color of its hair, the shape of its arms, the quiet intelligence in its eyes, and the heavy silence that fell over the woods in that moment. What still creeps me out the most is the way it just vanished back into the brush, like slipping behind a curtain. One moment it was there, solid and undeniable, and the next it was gone, leaving me feeling unsettled, curious, and honestly kind of small in comparison. I've never experienced anything like that again, and I'm still not sure what to make of it. There was no clear explanation. It's just something that happened on a normal summer day and then never happened again. But it stuck with me, and I guess it always will. Story 14. I still remember that day like it just happened, even though it's been decades since the mid-1970s. I was a local cop in a small town near Sweet Home, Oregon, and I'd just gotten home late in the afternoon after the kind of call I'd never dealt with before. I felt tense, unnerved, almost ashamed that something I'd always dismissed as nonsense had rattled me so deeply. It started when I was sent out to a rural spot known as Man's Ridge. A family that had recently moved into the area had reported strange noises at night, something heavy moving around their property, messing with their fences. I figured it would turn out to be a bear or maybe a couple of stray dogs. You know, typical wildlife getting too close to people's homes. But when I got there, the family looked genuinely shaken. I mean, they were scared in a way I hadn't seen before. The father had this look of confusion and fear, like he wanted to say something but didn't know how I'd take it. The mother stood behind him, holding their young kid close, eyes darting toward the tree line as if something was still lurking out there. I looked around and noticed the fences first. They weren't just broken or pushed in. They were twisted, yanked in a way that didn't make sense. The damage wasn't like what you'd get from a desperate animal pawing at wood. It looked more deliberate, as if someone with enormous strength had grabbed the wire and just yanked. I saw tufts of some kind of coarse hair stuck to the barbed wire. It didn't look like deer or elk hair, and I'd seen plenty of that growing up around here. This stuff was darker, thicker, almost like it didn't belong. The smell in the air was off too. I've been around dead animals. I've been around unbathed folks. I've smelled skunks and all sorts of nasty crap in my time, but this smell was different. It was earthy and foul, but not in a way I could put my finger on. More like a wet, matted fur smell mixed with something else I couldn't identify. And it lingered. Even with the evening breeze, that odor stuck around. I asked them what they'd seen, and they hesitated before saying anything. Eventually, they confessed it didn't look like any animal they knew. They said it walked on 2 legs, taller than any man, furry all over. And what really got me was when the father mentioned how it seemed smart enough to avoid the simple traps he'd tried setting out. It never took the bait. Instead, it circled the property, leaving footprints just beyond the range of their flashlight beams, as if it knew where they could and couldn't see. I tried to stay calm and professional, taking notes, collecting those hair samples. In my head, I was thinking maybe it's just a large bear with a skin condition, or some local prankster wearing a fur coat to scare new folks. But the longer I was there, the weirder it felt. There was this tension in the air, like every living thing around us had suddenly gone quiet. No birds, no crickets, no nothing. Just that strange smell and the faint creak of branches in the distance. I got this feeling in the pit of my stomach that told me something was off, and I hated myself for feeling it. I was supposed to be the calm presence, the stable figure these people could rely on, and here I was, feeling like a rookie on his first big call. When I took the hair samples back, I managed to get them looked at by a local university's lab. They weren't some big research center, but they had a guy who knew a thing or two about local wildlife genetics. He took his time and eventually told me that the hairs didn't match anything on record. He said it looked primate-like, but not quite. He said it was way thicker and longer than what you'd expect from any animal in the region. I could tell he was holding back too. He knew I wouldn't buy some wild theory, but he couldn't deny that the samples were strange. After that, I tried to report what I'd found. The higher-ups basically told me to keep it quiet. They didn't want the town's name dragged into some Bigfoot nonsense. It'll just cause panic, or make us a laughingstock, they said. But word got around anyway. People talk, especially when something doesn't add up. Some folks said it was just a hairy drifter causing trouble. Others started whispering about legendary creatures roaming the forests since before any of us were born. Even the local native communities had old stories of something like this, something that watches you from behind the trees. I never put much weight into that kind of talk before, but now I couldn't shake it off. I remember going home that evening, still feeling jumpy. I stopped by my neighbor's place because I just needed to get it off my chest. I didn't tell her all the details, but enough that she understood I was really shook up. I was a grown man, a police officer with years of experience, and I was trembling like I'd seen a ghost. My neighbor was kind, and I could see the concern in her eyes when she noticed how tense I was. I didn't spill everything. If I had, I don't know what she would have thought. But I had to say something, had to let someone know that I'd encountered something beyond the normal weirdness that comes with living near the woods. The truth is, I never saw the creature itself, just the evidence it left behind: twisted fences, unnatural hair, terrified people who had nothing to gain by making this up. That bothered me the most. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and each piece I picked up only made it stranger. We didn't have any bears in the area that matched that description, and no wild ape species live here. It wasn't a costume fiber. I know what that looks and feels like. This was something different. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept replaying the smell, that silence, the uneasy feeling that something was out there watching as I walked around that family's property. Even after I tried to put it out of my mind, it stuck to me like a bad dream. We're taught to rely on facts, on what we can prove. But what if the facts lead you somewhere that makes no sense? Over time, the incident just faded into the background. No one got hurt. Nothing too awful happened except some broken fences and a shaken family. Local authorities decided not to push it. Without clear evidence, and without me actually seeing the thing, who would believe me if I claimed it was something unknown? So I kept quiet. I did my job, I moved on to the next call, and life went on. But I never forgot. Even now, I remember those weird hairs and that twisted fence, and the terrified look on that family's faces. We never heard of another sighting quite like that one in Man's Ridge. At least, not officially. Some nights, if I was out on patrol, I'd wonder if it was still out there watching. Sometimes you'd hear people in town mention strange noises in the distance, but they'd always laugh it off or blame it on the wind. Maybe they didn't want to believe something was out there that didn't fit into a neat category. To this day, I don't have an explanation. I guess I never will. All I know is that I stumbled onto something that day that shook my understanding of what's possible in those woods. And even though nothing dramatic ever came of it, no big chase, no big reveal, I can't help feeling that I brushed against something we're not supposed to understand. It came and went, leaving nothing but confusion and a story I hardly dare to tell out loud. It's been decades, and I still get chills thinking about it. I have no idea what that thing was, and maybe that's for the best. Story 15. I remember that morning in February of 1994 so vividly it still makes my stomach turn. I got up before sunrise as usual, planning to check on my goats and start the day's work early. It had rained the night before, that usual Oregon drizzle that soaks into everything. The ground was damp, the air smelled like wet moss, and I could feel that slight chill that makes your teeth click if you stand still too long. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. To be honest, I was more worried about my old boots falling apart in the mud than anything else. My property wasn't big, just a modest piece of land near Welches, close to the mountains where the forest seems to swallow everything. The weather there is always kind of heavy and damp. I had a few goats, nothing fancy, but enough for some milk and wool. They were in a fenced area not too far from the main house. Normally, as I approached the enclosure, I'd hear some soft bleating. That morning, it was quiet. It was so quiet that I actually stopped walking for a second and tilted my head, trying to catch any sound. Nothing. Just the distant drip of water from leaves and a strange hush that felt unnatural. When I reached the fence, my heart sank. A whole section, maybe about 20 feet, was twisted in a way I can't even properly explain. I've seen trees toppled by storms. I've seen wire fences pulled down by deer. But this looked different. The metal wires were warped as if someone or something had grabbed them and applied a force that wasn't just pushing or pulling. It looked more like they'd been wrenched and bent. I ran my hand over the twisted parts and felt an uneasy tension in the pit of my stomach. Something strong had done this, something with hands. I know that sounds nuts, but that's what I kept thinking. Hands, not just claws or teeth. I glanced around quickly, expecting to find a broken tree limb or some tool left behind by a trespasser. Nothing, just the muddy ground and that heavy silence. Then I noticed I wasn't seeing all my goats. I had a handful, and I could count them easily by their distinct markings. One was missing, a young female I'd raised from birth. My gut reaction was that maybe she got out through the damaged fence and wandered off. It wouldn't be the first time an animal slipped away, but that twisting of the wire wouldn't have come from a goat or a simple escape. I started walking along the perimeter, calling out, just making the kind of noises I usually do to get the goats' attention. As I moved, I picked up a smell. It's hard to describe, but it was like something sour and unwashed, a mix of sweat, wet dog fur, and maybe old milk left in the sun. It made me hold my breath. I'd never smelled anything like it around my farm. Even the manure I'm used to was nothing compared to this strange, acrid odor. Then I saw them. Footprints. They stood out in the damp soil, huge and oddly detailed. I'm about average height, and these prints dwarfed my own boot prints. They had 5 toes, like a human footprint, but each toe was wide, almost as wide as 2 of my own. And the stride was long. Whoever or whatever made those prints was massive. I got down on one knee to look closer. The ground was soft from the rain, so the details were clear. There was some moss and small crushed branches pressed into the prints. I felt my heart pounding. I wanted to look around, to check if something was watching me, but I also didn't want to see what made those tracks. I felt trapped in that weird mental space where you want answers, but fear them at the same time. I followed the tracks a bit, hesitant with each step, noticing how they moved from the area near the fence toward the forest line. They seemed to go in a straight path, like something had walked in calmly, and then walked right out carrying... I hated to think it, but maybe carrying my goat. No signs of struggle, no blood, just vanished. I called out louder, hoping I'd hear a faint bleat in return, but I got nothing, just that damp silence again. The smell lingered, following me as I edged closer to the tree line. The forest out there is dense, full of ferns and thick undergrowth, the kind of place you get turned around in if you're not careful. I didn't dare go too deep. The idea of tracking this thing further made my skin crawl. I could imagine it watching me from behind a trunk, silently judging me for stepping closer. I ended up just standing at the edge, looking into the dark green gloom and feeling more helpless than I can remember. I tried asking around afterward. I walked to a neighbor's property, which isn't too far from mine. The old couple there said they heard strange sounds the previous night, some sort of whistling and a series of snaps, like branches being broken deliberately. They didn't see anything, but their dogs were restless. Another neighbor said he thought he heard something large moving along the tree line, but he assumed it was a bear. Bears don't leave footprints like that, though, and I know the local wildlife well enough to say I've never seen anything like what I found that morning. I even tried talking to an older friend who'd lived in the area his entire life. He mentioned how, in his youth, people whispered about tall, hairy creatures that lurked in the forests, occasionally messing with people's livestock. He said it with a straight face, almost like it was common knowledge once you got far enough back in the woods. I don't want to believe in legends, but I also can't deny what I saw with my own eyes. The footprints, the twisted fence, the missing goat, it all points to something I can't explain. After that day, I reinforced the fencing and kept a close watch. I set up lanterns and even a flashlight or two near the goats at night. The sour smell never returned, or at least I never caught it as strongly again. My other goats were fine, no more intrusions, and the twisted section of the fence remained as a reminder that something powerful had been there. Eventually, I tried to move on. I told a few people in town about it, got a few odd looks, a few knowing nods from some folks who insisted weird things happened up in those hills. But the truth is, I never got my goat back, and I never saw anything that could give me solid answers. The footprints vanished into the woods that morning, and so did whatever made them. That's what haunts me the most. It came in so quietly and left so little behind besides confusion and fear. I still think about it on those quiet mornings when the forest is draped in fog and everything smells damp. I look at the spot where the fence was mangled and wonder what was strong enough to do that. Sometimes I think I see something moving between the trees, but it's always just a trick of the light. I don't claim to know what happened that day. I don't have evidence besides my word and the fence that I eventually fixed. But if anyone ever tells you that there's nothing strange in the forests near Welches, Oregon, I'll tell you they're wrong. I know what I saw, or at least I know what I found. After all these years, I'm no closer to an explanation. It was there, and then it was gone, leaving me with questions that still make me uneasy whenever I let my mind wander back to that February morning in 1994. Story 16. It was the mid-1970s, and I was living alone in a small place near Forks, Washington. Back then, it felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. The forests were thick around my land, and the nearest neighbors were at least a couple of miles away. I had a simple life, a small house, a few heads of cattle, and a wooden barn where I stored hay, tools, and feed. I remember that night like it happened yesterday, even though so many years have passed. It was late, well after midnight. I'd already turned off my lights, settled into bed, and was drifting in and out of sleep. The quiet out there was something I'd gotten used to. It was almost comforting. But that night, I was jolted awake by this strange noise coming from the direction of my barn. It sounded like wood scraping, maybe something heavy being tossed around, and a kind of soft, muffled thumping that I couldn't place. At first, I thought one of my cows had gotten loose and knocked something over, or maybe a bear had wandered in looking for easy food. Bears weren't common, but they weren't out of the question either. I climbed out of bed and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't have a gun. I never felt I needed one. Maybe that was naive, but back then I just didn't think about it. I threw on a coat over my nightgown and slipped into my boots without bothering to lace them. The air outside was cold enough that I could see my breath. There was a thin layer of fog near the ground, and the moon was out, but only gave a faint glow through the tall trees. As I approached the barn, I kept the flashlight low, not wanting to shine it straight ahead just yet. If it was a bear, I figured I'd back off. If it was a person, well, I didn't know what I'd do, but I wanted at least the advantage of seeing them first. The barn door was partly open, which was strange, because I always locked it at night. I could see that something inside had been disturbed. The quiet that had settled after the noise made me uneasy. It was as if something realized I was coming and froze. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. I stepped closer, up to maybe 10 or 15 feet away. I raised the flashlight beam and swept it slowly inside. Hay bales looked pushed around, tools scattered. The pitchfork was on the ground. A bucket lay on its side. Nothing was missing as far as I could tell later, but in that moment, I was just trying to understand what I was looking at. The place looked like it had been searched by something that didn't care about neatness. Then, as I leaned a bit, the beam caught movement in the far corner. Something big and dark ducked away from the light with a quick, fluid motion. I caught just a glimpse of a massive form, covered in dark hair, like a thick coat of fur, standing upright, not on all fours like a bear, but upright. It moved so fast, stepping out of my line of sight, and then slipping out through a gap on the barn's side wall. I remember hearing this faint scraping as it moved between the boards and out into the night. I stood there, not sure if I should run back inside or follow it. But my legs felt like lead. I'll never forget that shape. It was tall. I know that's a vague word, but it had to be taller than any man I'd ever met. The shoulders were broad, and the head seemed to sit close to the shoulders, almost hunching a bit. The hair was dark, but in the flashlight's beam, I could see it wasn't black, maybe a dark brown. I didn't see its face, and I'm not sure if I'm thankful or disappointed about that. In that instant, I truly couldn't rationalize what I'd just seen. I was terrified, but also strangely curious. I stood there for a minute, my flashlight shaking in my hand, trying to wrap my head around it. The night was silent again, but now I felt exposed. I pulled the barn door shut and slid the latch, though I knew that if whatever it was had gotten in that easily, a latch wouldn't do much. Still, I had to do something. I backed away slowly, keeping the flashlight trained on the barn, and then I turned and hurried back to the house. Once inside, I locked my doors, pulled the curtains, and just sat at the kitchen table. I remember pouring a small glass of whiskey, something I rarely did, just to calm my nerves. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that tall, hairy silhouette darting out of sight. By morning, when the light finally came through my windows, I went out to see if I could make any sense of it. I inspected the barn first. Inside, there were footprints in the dried dirt floor. Huge footprints. They weren't shaped like a bear's prints. They looked more human-like, with a broad heel and distinguishable toes, but easily twice the size of my own foot, and I'm not a small woman. The prints were spaced as if whatever made them took long strides. On the barn walls near the door, I found these strange markings, like something big had steadied itself or tried to push off. The marks looked like large handprints smudged in dust and maybe a bit of old grime. They were bigger than my hands by a good measure. The cattle were shaken but unharmed. Nothing valuable was taken. My tools were still there, just scattered. It didn't feel like a robbery. It felt like something came in out of curiosity, rummaged around, got startled when I approached, and bolted. That bothered me even more, because it meant it wasn't a mindless animal looking for food. It seemed more inquisitive, maybe even intelligent enough to care about not being seen. Later that day, I tried talking to a couple of folks who lived not too far away, people who might have an explanation. One of them hinted at old stories that used to circulate around the area, talk about tall, hairy creatures that roamed the deep forests. He shrugged and said nobody ever got hurt. At least that's what he'd heard. but there were rumors and strange footprints found once in a while. Another neighbor suggested it was someone playing a prank, wearing a suit, trying to scare me. But who would do that in the middle of nowhere, at night, risking getting shot by a frightened homeowner? It didn't add up. I'll be honest, I didn't know what to believe. I wasn't ready to call it anything specific, not then, and even now I'm reluctant. I'd grown up around animals, and I knew bears, deer, elk, and even the stray cougar. This didn't fit any of those, and the size of the prints, the way it moved, the broadness of its shape. Nothing matched a person in a costume. It looked and moved too naturally, and the strength it must have had to push aside those heavy boards on the barn wall was incredible. After that night, I started taking small precautions. I didn't have much in terms of security, so I made a few changes. I reinforced the barn door with an extra lock. I hung a couple of lanterns outside to keep the yard lit. I didn't expect to keep it away if it really wanted to come back, but I figured extra light might discourage it. I slept poorly for a while, always listening for strange noises. But the nights were quiet after that. No more disturbances, no more footprints, no more sounds of anything rummaging around. I can't explain why it only happened that one time. Maybe it realized I was there and decided to stay away. Maybe it found what it was looking for elsewhere, or maybe it was just passing through and had no reason to return. The uneasy feeling lingered, though. Whenever I looked at the tree line, I wondered if it was watching me from behind the ferns or behind one of those massive cedars. I'd sometimes stand at the kitchen window at dusk, staring at the darkening forest, expecting a sudden movement that never came. Over the following weeks and months, people either believed me or politely dismissed my story. Some chalked it up to a bear or a drifter. Others would wink and say I'd seen one of those things people whispered about, but never openly named. I had no photographs, no evidence other than the footprints I saw and the marks on the barn that faded over time. Eventually, it became just another odd thing that happened to me in that lonely patch of Washington forest. I never got closure, never understood it fully. But I remember that night clearly. The cold air, the quiet after the noise, the way the flashlight beam caught that silhouette. The shape of something huge, hairy, and unmistakably upright, the speed at which it vanished, that sense of standing there, helpless, not sure if I'd just come face to face with something we're not supposed to see. Even now, I can feel that tension in my chest. I kept living there for a few more years before I eventually moved closer to town for unrelated reasons. Life goes on. But I never forgot that night. I never forgot the way my barn was turned inside out by something that seemed curious yet cautious. It left me with more questions than answers. I think that's why it's always stuck in my mind. There was no grand showdown, no dramatic confrontation, just a brief, unsettling encounter with something I can't fully explain. To this day, I still wonder what I saw. I have my own suspicions, but I've learned to keep them to myself. I guess some things out there don't need to be proven or believed by everyone. They're just out there, and sometimes, if you're unlucky or lucky, depending on how you see it, you cross paths with them. After that night, I realized the forest holds secrets that don't care if we understand them or not. It happened, and then it stopped, leaving me stuck with a memory that still sends chills down my spine when I think about it, and that's all I know. Story 17. Back in the summer of 1992, I took a trip out to the forests near Hayden, Idaho. I was a philosophy professor back then, and I wanted to get away for a while, away from lectures, from all the academic chatter. I needed peace, a chance to walk in silence, think about my life, and maybe clear my head. That morning I set out early, carrying just a small backpack with some water, a sandwich, and a notebook. The trails weren't popular in that part of the forest, which was exactly what I wanted. No crowds, no voices, just me and whatever lived quietly out there. The day was warm, but not unbearable. The pine needles under my boots made that soft, crunching sound I always found soothing. After a few hours, I decided to leave the main path and follow a small creek I'd spotted. The water was shallow and cold, running over smooth stones. I remember thinking how perfect it would be to sit there and just listen. But I went on, off track, making my way through clusters of ferns and the occasional fallen branch. At some point, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't dramatic, just this subtle shift. The forest got quieter in a way I can't fully explain. The birds seemed fewer, or maybe they just stopped singing. I felt a tension in my chest, not fear exactly, just something telling me to pay attention. That's when I first heard it, a strange metallic clicking, like stones being tapped against each other. Clink, clink, with a rhythm that seemed too regular to be random. I slowed down, taking care not to make noise. I crouched low and moved toward the sound, pushing aside some thick bushes. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I figured maybe it was just rocks falling or water hitting stones in a certain way. But it wasn't the creek. The sound came from a clearing about 100 yards ahead. That's when I saw them. There were two large figures, covered in dark, matted hair, standing in a small, open patch of ground near a pile of rocks. These weren't bears. They were tall, taller than any person I'd met. Their shoulders were broad and their arms long and muscular. I remember how deliberate their movements were, each one bending down, lifting a heavy stone, and placing it carefully onto what looked like a growing stack of rocks. They were building something, or arranging something, I'm sure of it. I felt my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid they'd hear it. My hands were shaking, and I tried to calm my breathing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They worked quietly and methodically. One would hand a stone to the other, and they'd both step back to look, as if judging how it fit. There was this feeling in the air, like watching someone perform a ritual or a carefully memorized routine. It didn't feel random. It felt intentional. They made low sounds now and then, soft grunts and quiet murmurs. It didn't sound like the angry calls you'd imagine from wild creatures. It sounded more like whispers or low voices just checking in with each other. I was close enough to see their faces were somewhat flatter than ours, with dark eyes that seemed focused and calm. I never saw any sign of aggression. If anything, they seemed peaceful, completely absorbed in their task. Then two smaller ones appeared, kind of shy, with hair that had a reddish tint. They came into the clearing for a moment, picked up a few smaller stones, placed them, then backed away. The two bigger ones didn't scold them or chase them off. It looked like they accepted the help. It all happened in such a strange hush. The forest didn't suddenly erupt with noise. It was all so quiet that I could still hear my own heartbeat. After several minutes, the bigger figures seemed satisfied. They stepped back and just stood there, looking at the stack of stones. It wasn't huge. It was about knee-high, maybe a bit more, made of carefully chosen rocks stacked in a certain pattern. I swear it looked like more than just a pile, maybe a marker or a sign. Then, as calmly as they'd arrived, they began to move away, disappearing back into the trees. They made no rush, no panic. They just vanished into the foliage, walking with a kind of steady silence that I wouldn't think possible for such large beings. I didn't move for a long time. I was afraid to break the spell. I kept watching that empty clearing, waiting for them to come back, to confirm I hadn't lost my mind. When they didn't return, I eventually got the courage to approach the spot myself. The stone formation was still there, exactly as they'd left it. They must have spent real effort selecting and placing each rock. Nothing was random. I inspected it closely. There were no carvings, no obvious markers, but the arrangement was too purposeful to be a coincidence of nature. I stood there feeling a weird mixture of awe, confusion, and fear. Not fear of them harming me, but fear of realizing I'd just seen something that shouldn't exist, at least not according to what I'd been taught. I remember thinking, no one will believe me. And I was right. No one really did, at least not the few people I dared to tell. I tried describing them and the odd ritual I'd witnessed. Most reactions ranged from skeptical smiles to outright disbelief. There was no trace of hostility in what I saw. No hunting, no violence, nothing like that. They weren't dragging carcasses or acting like predators. They were building something meaningful to them. The calmness, the intention, it threw me off completely. It was the kind of behavior you'd expect from humans or from some very intelligent animal. But I'd never heard of anything like this before. Eventually, I left the clearing. I spent the rest of the day making my way back, stopping every so often, paranoid that I was being followed, even though I never heard another sound. When I got back to where I was staying, I just sat there for hours trying to process it. I didn't sleep well that night. My mind kept replaying the image of those two large figures lifting rocks and stacking them, as if marking that remote spot deep in the Idaho woods. Over the years, I've often thought about that day. I've wondered if anyone else has seen them or something like them. I've asked myself what that stone marker meant. Territory, a memorial, a message to others of their kind. I have no idea. That experience stuck with me because it didn't fit into the categories I knew. I've never found a solid explanation, and to be honest, I've stopped trying. I can still picture every detail. The humidity of the air, the dappled light through the leaves, their dark hair, their enormous shoulders, the gentle way they placed each stone. It's been a long time since that summer day, but the memory hasn't faded. I never got closure, and I guess I never will. They were there, and then they were gone, leaving me with nothing but questions and the lingering sense that there's a lot more going on in those forests than we can understand. I've made my peace with not knowing. It happened, I saw it, and that's all there is to it. Story 18. I remember it was sometime around 1985, a late summer morning if I'm not mistaken. I was staying at my aunt's place near Fairchild Air Force Base, just outside Spokane, Washington. She didn't have a big house, just a modest place out in this sort of rural military mix of an area. You'd see fields and woods, but also hear jets and helicopters passing overhead now and then. It was quiet most days, almost too quiet for someone like me, who was used to more noise and people. But that day, the quiet broke in a way I never expected. It must have been around 11 in the morning. I was sitting out in my aunt's backyard, which was basically just a patch of grass and a few old wooden chairs, beyond which stretched a bit of woodland. You could still catch a glimpse of the Air Force Base in the distance if you angled yourself right. I remember feeling almost half asleep, just enjoying the stillness, when I heard this deep, throbbing sound that got louder by the second. You know the kind of sound I mean, when a helicopter is flying real low, that dense, pulsing vibration you feel in your chest before you actually see it. I looked up, kind of squinting because the sun was out, and I saw this big military helicopter, the type with two rotors, like a Chinook, I think. It was heading west, flying lower than I'd ever seen around there. My first thought was that maybe there had been some kind of emergency, maybe a crash in the woods, or they were hauling out something heavy. It had a large cargo net attached underneath it, and inside that net I could see a jumble of branches, leaves and debris swinging around like the helicopter had just scooped up a chunk of forest floor. But here's the thing. Among the branches, I noticed these shapes. At first, I couldn't quite make it out. They seemed like big, dark, furry forms. I remember standing up, feeling my heartbeat pick up. I moved closer to the fence, trying to get a better look. These weren't just piles of dirt or bundles of leaves. They looked like bodies, large, hairy bodies. I could make out limbs, something like arms and legs. They were all tangled in the net with branches and foliage. I couldn't tell if they were alive or dead, or even what they were exactly. I just knew they looked wrong, too big to be normal animals. They definitely weren't bears. Their proportions seemed more human-like, but they were covered in dark hair, like some kind of ape. But apes in Washington state? That made no sense to me. I stood there, stunned, as the helicopter flew by. It wasn't even that far overhead, maybe a couple 100 feet above the treetops. The downdraft rustled leaves and made this eerie whooshing noise. I felt this chill run down my spine. I was pretty sure I shouldn't be seeing what I was seeing. It felt like stumbling onto some secret you're not supposed to know about. My mouth went dry, and my mind raced to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was some sort of research operation. Maybe these were props, or something related to a training exercise. But why would they haul out these giant, hairy shapes along with branches and debris? I tried to keep watching until the helicopter disappeared over the horizon. There was this strange emptiness that settled in after it was gone. Like all the usual background sounds went hush for a moment. I remember noticing how my hands were shaking. I wasn't exactly terrified yet, just completely off balance, confused and uneasy. It was the kind of feeling you get when you witness something that defies what you think is normal. After a few minutes, I went inside my aunt's house. She wasn't around at that moment, off running errands, I think. I felt an urge to call someone, to find out if anybody else saw it. I picked up the phone and tried calling some local offices, some general information lines, even tried the local sheriff's department. I was careful with what I said, just asking if there'd been any known military operations that involved hauling debris from the woods. I got mostly vague answers. No one said anything that helped. They either didn't know, or they were doing a great job pretending they didn't. I also tried calling a couple of local environmental or wildlife offices. Nothing. They either brushed me off politely or acted like they had no idea what I was talking about. A few times, I sensed their tone change when I mentioned the helicopter and strange cargo, like a pause before they said something generic. It only made me more nervous. There was this feeling in the pit of my stomach that I was treading into territory I shouldn't. A couple of days later, I got a call. It was a man's voice, firm but calm. He never identified himself. He just said something along the lines of, "You know, there's nothing unusual about what you saw. Maybe you were mistaken. I wouldn't worry about it." His tone wasn't overtly threatening, but there was a weight behind it, like a warning. I can't remember his exact words, but it was crystal clear that he wanted me to drop it. I remember feeling this sudden wave of fear wash over me when I hung up. I had never told anyone who I was, or left my number anywhere official. Yet this man knew I'd been asking questions. He knew I'd been poking around, trying to find out more. That spooked me more than seeing the helicopter itself. It suggested that something about that helicopter and its cargo was sensitive, something I wasn't meant to talk about. I tried to think through what I had seen. The shapes in that net were large, easily as long as a human adult, but bulkier, covered in dark brown or black hair. They didn't look like any bear I'd seen, and living near those woods, I'd seen bears. These were different. Their limbs looked more defined, like arms and legs, not just an animal's legs. And the military hauling them away, along with broken branches and leaves, as if they had just collected them from some area deep in the forest, was too bizarre to ignore. I wondered if maybe some unknown primate species had been discovered, maybe a population of something like Bigfoot. I mean, I never really believed in that kind of thing before. But what else could explain those forms? Maybe there was some incident, an explosion or a fire, and these creatures got caught up in it. The helicopter could have been removing evidence before anyone noticed. Or could it have been some secret military experiment gone wrong? The fact that a random caller warned me off was what really fueled my imagination. But I had no proof. I hadn't taken any photos. I hadn't even told my aunt. She was a no-nonsense type, and I doubted she'd believe me anyway. Everything I had was locked in my own memory. I remember stepping outside again that same afternoon and just looking at the sky, half expecting to see more helicopters. The air felt heavier. I noticed how quiet the neighborhood was. It was as if everyone else had simply gone about their day, unaware of the strange cargo passing overhead. Over time, I stopped trying to call anyone. It felt pointless and maybe even risky. The uneasy feeling lingered, though. For weeks after, every time I saw a helicopter, I'd get a little jolt of adrenaline, half expecting to see something bizarre hanging from it. But I never saw anything like that again. No news reports ever mentioned it. No stories in the local papers. Just silence. That bugged me. Even if it had been a normal operation, some kind of forest cleanup, or maybe transporting large animal carcasses for research, wouldn't someone at least acknowledge it if asked politely? The secrecy around it made the whole thing feel like I'd stumbled onto a hidden chapter of reality. Now, years later, I still think back to that morning. If I close my eyes, I can picture the helicopter's shape, the sound of its blades chopping through the air, and that strange bundle swaying beneath it. Those dark, hairy forms, humanoid but not quite human, still haunt my mind. I wish I could say I found some explanation, that I connected the dots, but I never did. I guess I learned that sometimes you see things you can't explain, and you might never get a straight answer. Maybe I witnessed something that was never meant to be public. Maybe it was a once-in-a-lifetime accident, a glimpse behind a curtain that's usually drawn tight. I don't know if those things were the legendary creatures people whisper about, or if they were something else entirely. I just know what I saw, and I know how it made me feel, confused, scared, and very aware that the world is bigger and stranger than we like to admit. I never got another threatening call, never had men in suits show up at my door. It just faded away like a dream that leaves you uneasy all day but can't be proven real. But I can't forget it. To this day, every time I think about it, I get that same hollow feeling in my stomach. That day in 1985 was just a normal morning, until it wasn't. I've tried to move on, but that memory is burned into my head, and I guess that's just how it is. Sometimes you have to accept that certain things remain unsaid, unanswered, and unresolved. It happened, then it stopped, and I never figured out why. Story 19. I still remember that day so clearly, even though it happened back in 1979. It was Easter Sunday, late afternoon, not long after we'd finished up our family meal. My parents, aunts, uncles, and a bunch of cousins had gathered at my uncle's place just outside Peoria, Illinois. The property was pretty big, fields stretching out behind the old farmhouse, a small pond near the back corner, and beyond that, a patch of woods with a narrow creek running through it. The area around there was always peaceful and quiet. It felt safe, maybe even a little boring at times. That's probably why I never expected anything weird to happen. After most of the main festivities were over, a few of us decided to walk around, enjoy the last bit of daylight. One of my relatives, my older cousin, was practicing target shooting with a small rifle over by one of the fields. He'd set up some cans on a fallen log. He wasn't really hitting much, but nobody seemed to mind. I was hanging back with two of my cousins, both older than me, and a younger kid, my cousin's little brother, who must have been about 8 at the time. We just kind of wandered near the edge of the property, heading toward the creek. There was no plan. We were just curious. Kids do that, I guess. We'd been walking for maybe 15 minutes, not straying too far, just poking around and making our way toward a spot where the creek cut down into a small ravine. The soil around there was loose, forming a slope down toward the water that was partially hidden by brush. There were scattered trees and a few old stumps. The sun was low but still bright enough to see clearly. It was one of those mild spring evenings where the weather is just right, not too cold, not too warm. At some point, I remember noticing that the usual sounds had gone quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was like someone had flipped a switch, and the whole background noise just died out. I knew these woods weren't dense like a forest, but there were enough trees to create shadows and give off that feeling that something could be hiding just behind a trunk or a clump of bushes. I didn't think much of it at first, but the silence got under my skin after a minute or two. My cousins noticed it too. I could tell by how they slowed down, looking over their shoulders. I was standing at the top of the ravine, trying to see the trickle of water below, when I heard it. Heavy steps from somewhere in the trees. These weren't just normal footsteps like a person's. They were heavier, like something big was shifting its weight slowly, deliberately. It wasn't a deer's quick movement, and it definitely wasn't just the wind. We all froze. The older kids tried to joke at first, whispering that maybe it was a deer or a wild turkey, but nobody was laughing. It didn't feel right. It felt like we were being watched. The younger kid started backing up, looking around for any adults. I followed him, and the older ones did the same. None of us ran, but we kind of formed a tight group as we moved away from that ravine and back toward the open field. One of us yelled for an adult, my uncle, I think, just shouting his name into the trees. After a moment, he came jogging over. He had his rifle in hand, not pointing it at anything, just carrying it casually at his side. We told him what we'd heard. He looked skeptical, but walked closer to where we'd been standing. He peered into the trees, scanning the dim spaces between trunks. I could see his expression change as he stood there. He got quieter, more alert. He didn't see anything, at least not that he mentioned, but he told us to come back up toward the car. He didn't say it with any real urgency, but I could sense something was off. Grown-ups had that way of trying not to scare kids, but I picked up on it anyway. On our way back, as we passed through the edge of the field, I noticed a smell. It came out of nowhere, like we'd walked through an invisible cloud of it. It was awful, rotting, musty, and just wrong. I've smelled dead animals before, but this was different. It was stronger, like if you took that decay smell and mixed it with something swampy and sour. Everyone scrunched up their noses. We looked around but couldn't find any source, no carcass, no pile of leaves concealing something dead. The smell just drifted around us and then faded as the wind shifted. When we finally got back to the car, I saw the rest of the family gathering up their things, getting ready to head home. My uncle, the one with the gun, stayed behind for a moment, staring at the tree line. He squinted, as if trying to pick out a shape or movement. After a few seconds, he shrugged it off, put the rifle in the trunk, and told us all to hop in. At that point, none of us had seen anything concrete. We just had a bunch of weird feelings, strange sounds, and that nauseating smell. As we pulled away, I rolled down the window, hoping for a bit of fresh air. That's when I heard a sharp, piercing whistle. It cut through the silence, echoing back from the woods. It didn't sound like any bird I knew. It was almost too loud, too deliberate. I craned my neck to look, but I saw nothing, just darkening shadows under the trees. The whistle sounded once more, and then we were too far down the dirt road to hear anything else. We never did figure out what it was. Later that night, when we were back home, a few of the older relatives tried to come up with explanations. Maybe a bear, they said, though they all knew black bears were rare around there, and we certainly had never seen one. Maybe a big deer spooked by our presence, but the sound of those footsteps had felt heavier than that. One of my uncles, after a few beers, mentioned stories he'd heard from other counties, rumors about large, hairy creatures roaming in the backwoods. but he laughed it off as nonsense, and nobody pressed him on it. For days after, I'd think back to that moment by the ravine. The memory stuck with me. The sudden silence, the stepping sounds that felt too solid, too careful. The awful smell that came and went too fast. The sense that something was right there, watching us, deciding what to do next. I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, not by a curious deer or a scavenging coyote, but by something else. Something that didn't want to be seen, something that knew how to stay hidden. We never found tracks, never saw any broken branches or half-eaten carcasses. Nobody got hurt, and there was no dramatic confrontation. We left, and whatever was out there stayed behind. It never followed us, never showed up at the farmhouse, never gave us any clear sign. It just existed in that moment. Footsteps, a foul smell, a sharp whistle, and then it was gone. Over the years I've told this story to a few people, and I still don't have a neat explanation. It's just one of those things that happened and then ended, leaving more questions than answers. It could have been a strange animal passing through. It could have been something else entirely. I still don't know. All I know is that on that Easter Sunday in 1979, I felt fear and confusion in a place that had always felt safe, and to this day, I can't explain what we encountered in those trees. Story 20. I remember it was early afternoon, maybe late summer of 1948. I was around 15 at the time, living near Lake Common in rural California. Back then, we had nothing better to do than wander the woods, carrying our little pellet guns and shooting at empty cans or old logs, just passing the time. I still recall that day so clearly, like some strange stain in my memory that I can't shake off. The smell hit us before anything else. I mean, we were used to the scent of damp leaves, animal droppings, even the occasional whiff of a dead raccoon. But this was different, thick, rotten, and somehow warm, like something had been left to stew in the heat. We were a small group of friends, maybe 4 or 5 of us, scattered around but never too far apart. I remember nudging one of the guys, asking if he smelled it too. Everyone did. It was impossible to ignore. We followed it almost without talking to each other, just giving hand signals and uneasy looks, trying to figure out where the hell it was coming from. We ended up pushing through some dense brush. There was a kind of clearing, though it looked more like something had forced its way through rather than a place that was naturally open. It felt wrong as soon as we stepped into it. Some of the branches were snapped clean off, and the grass and smaller plants were flattened. I remember running my fingers over one of the broken branches. Whatever broke it didn't just step on it by accident. It looked twisted and torn in a way that suggested real strength. One of us pointed out clumps of dark hair caught on some thorny bushes. This wasn't the fur we knew from local critters. Bears weren't exactly common around our area, but we had at least seen pelts and knew what bear hair looked like. This was different. Long strands, almost coarse, with a strange texture, and it smelled terrible. Everything in that spot smelled like that nauseating stench. On the ground we found these large, almost shape-shifting impressions, like footprints but not quite. They looked more like something heavy had pressed down, but the edges weren't crisp. They weren't paws, that was for sure. I remember crouching near one of those impressions, trying to guess where the toes would be, if there were toes at all. The soil was a bit damp, and I could see where water had pooled in parts of the imprint, giving it a weird shine. We were just kids, and as curious as we were, it started to feel too eerie. We called one of the older guys, an uncle or older cousin of one of my friends. He was a seasoned outdoorsman. He came reluctantly. I guess he thought we were overreacting. But when he got there, he got quiet. This was a man who could track a wounded deer for miles, who knew every type of animal that came through those woods. He didn't have an explanation. He kind of scratched his beard and looked around, muttering something about a sick bear or something that had passed through. But you could tell he wasn't convinced by his own words. No bones, No real signs of a fight or anything like that. Just this weird, messy clearing with hair we didn't recognize and that stomach-churning stench that was making my eyes water. I remember at one point I gagged and had to step away because the smell was too intense. It was almost like rotten eggs mixed with something sour and musky, something that felt primal and off. We hung around that spot for a while, not sure what to do. It was dead quiet, no birds, no squirrels rustling the leaves, nothing. That silence alone was unsettling. Usually the woods had some background noise. You'd hear branches creaking or distant chirps, but there it was, just still. I felt exposed, like we were standing in the middle of something's territory, and it could appear at any second. A couple of the others started to get uneasy, talking in hushed tones about local legends, crazy old stories about wild men in the woods. I never really believed that stuff, but looking at the flattened vegetation and those strange hairs, I was starting to doubt what I knew. I remember feeling a chill run down my spine. There was something about the place that made me feel like we were being watched, even though I never heard a twig snap or saw a shape in the trees. The adult tried to calm us down, telling us we should leave. He wasn't yelling or anything, just kind of insisting we had no business being there. I think he sensed something was off. We left that clearing, but none of us said much on the way back. The smell seemed to follow us for a bit, like it lingered on our clothes and in our nostrils. Eventually, the normal smells of pine and earth took over again, and we could breathe easier. Back at home, we tried to explain what we'd seen, but we had no real evidence besides some scrawny hairs a friend tried to bring back on a stick. Honestly, I don't think anyone ever truly believed us outside our own little group. People said we exaggerated. Some older folks laughed it off, said it must have been a sick animal passing through. But we knew what bears looked like, and none of us had ever seen anything like that before. As the years passed and I heard more and more stories, whispers about strange creatures spotted in distant forests, I couldn't help but think back to that day. The way the branches were snapped and twisted, the way the ground was pressed down, the hair that didn't match any animal we knew. And that smell, God, I'll never forget that smell. Even today, I can't fully describe it. It was just wrong. I've never had another experience like that, and nothing else ever turned up in that exact spot. Whatever made that clearing look like that, whatever left that hair behind, it never showed itself to us. Maybe we just got there too late, and it was long gone. Or maybe it watched us from behind some thick trunk, waiting for us to leave, just as suspicious of us as we were of it. I've thought about that possibility more than I care to admit. Even now, all I have are questions. I don't know what we stumbled onto. Nothing ever attacked us. We never heard a roar or a howl. It was just that weird, overpowering stench and those unsettling signs of something out of place. Over time, people around the area just treated it like a strange rumor, something to mention at gatherings when old times were discussed. But I know what we saw, what we smelled, what we felt. To this day, I have no explanation. I can't say for sure it was what people now call Bigfoot or a wild man living off the land. Maybe it was a sick bear, a freak of nature, or maybe it was something else entirely. We never found out. We just stood there that day, eyes watering from the stench, hearts pounding in our chests, and minds racing with possibilities. Eventually, life moved on. We got older, had different problems, different priorities, but the memories stayed. Sometimes I wish I had taken something more than just a tuft of that hair, or taken a picture, though we didn't really have a camera handy back then. Maybe it's better that I didn't. Maybe it's one of those mysteries that's just meant to linger in my mind, reminding me that out there, near places we think we know, there can be secrets that slip through our understanding. It never happened again, at least not to me. That day stands on its own, a strange moment in my past that I've never fully come to terms with. I still wonder what it was, And I guess I'll never really know.